One of my earliest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating around the neighborhood that I grew up in. I didn't have much of a costume because I only decided last minute that I wanted to join my big brother. I've been terrified at the idea of all these miniature monsters walking around outside, but that fear was gradually and eventually outweighed by the promise of a huge haul of Halloween candy. My mom used some leftover monster makeup to paint my face like a skeleton, and then I wore a torn-up trash bag like I was some kind of garbage ghoul. And I must have looked pretty silly compared to some of the other kids in their Batman and Superman costumes, but that didn't really bother me. All I was interested in was getting my fair share of candy, and boy, was there lots of that. My brother was 13 at the time, so he agreed to escort 9-year-old me around the neighborhood with him and his friends from middle school. And I couldn't believe that I'd been so frightened by the whole thing, because actually being out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes, it was some of the most fun I'd ever had in my entire young life. People were giving us a ton of candy. And not just candy either, they were giving us all kinds of things. One house we knocked at, I think it was the town dentist, gave us all toothbrushes and then reveled in our looks of disappointment because they revealed that they were just kidding and gave us some real candy. Another place gave us all these miniature Charlie Brown comic books. But at one point, a man told me to open up my candy bag and then drop something small and white into it before walking off. I didn't realize Halloween was like Christmas, only spookier, and by the time me and my brother arrived back home, I think it had fast become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember, our mom asked us to empty out our bags of candy at either ends of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take maybe 3/4 of what we gotten, then put it somewhere safe so we couldn't eat ourselves into a diabetic coma. But shortly after emptying my bag onto the table, Mom came over to divide up the spoils and took one look through my candy and then immediately started to freak out. She kept pointing at this one particular item and asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" Then when I told her I didn't know, she kept yelling at me to think harder, that I had to remember who put it in my bag. I remember getting upset and starting to cry, and then crying even harder when my mom picked up the phone and told the operator to put her through to the police, because in her words, this was an emergency. Now 30 years before, back when my mom was around my age, all the kids in the town we grew up in went trick-or-treating on Halloween. One little girl went out with her friends, but didn't just come home with a bag full of candy. She returned home with a little white doll stitched out of cloth rags. The girl's mom didn't think anything of it and let her daughter keep the little white doll. But just a few days later, there was an incident in a public park. The girl's mom took her to the park, someplace that had like a sand pit and a jungle gym, and while her kids were off playing with the other children, she strikes up a conversation with one of the other moms. The whole time, some guy had been leaning on the fence surrounding the jungle gym. The lady figured that he must have been one of the kids' fathers, maybe even grandfathers, just watching on as his kids or grandkids played with all the others. But then, as the mom's looking on, she sees the guy get her daughter's attention, call her over towards the fence, and then starts talking to her. Again, this all appeared perfectly harmless, but then the mom watches as the guy who's wearing a long coat, hat, and a scarf, just covered up so his face is slightly obscured, reaches out and asks for her hand. The mom watches as her little girl gives the man her hand, and then when the guy leaned forward and appeared to start smelling her little girl's hand, she starts walking over to intervene. She tells her kid to get away from the strange man, then starts asking him what his business is talking to children like that. The guy didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked off before the mom could actually confront him. Naturally, the mom wanted to know what the man had said to her little girl, but when she asked her, the answer she got back raised more questions than they answered. First off, the little girl said she couldn't understand what the man was saying to her, but when her mom asked how she knew to walk over and give the man her hand, all at his direction, she acted very confused and then said she didn't know. The girl also said that when he raised her hand to the man, he hadn't sniffed it, like her mom thought he had. Instead, he'd said something to it, something which again the little girl couldn't understand. The girl's mom then asked if she knew the man from anywhere, like if she'd seen him around town, and the girl replied yes. It was the same man who'd given her the little white doll while she was trick-or-treating. As you can imagine, the mom was terrified, and in discovering the connection between the doll and that creepy man, she rushed to inform the police. The cops put out some APB on the guy, and almost every cop in town was out looking for him, but after no one caught sight of him, they figured that he'd been a drifter that had skipped town at the first sight of trouble. None of the moms from the park recognized the guy, which, in a town our size, usually meant that he was an out-of-towner. So when 48 hours went by, and there had been no sightings of the guy from either civilians or law enforcement, everyone just kind of figured the guy had moved on. It took just days before they realized how wrong they were. One morning, a young mom walked into her daughter's bedroom to wake her up for elementary school, only to find that she wasn't in her bed. She looked around the house a little, then when she realized her daughter was nowhere to be found, she alerted her husband, who in turn called the cops. And within 24 hours, almost every cop in the state was out looking for this missing girl. But while a whole army of cops and volunteers are out searching the fields and woods surrounding town, a team of state police detectives performed a search of the girl's bedroom, I'm guessing to see if they could find any clues. And guess what they found? Tucked into the missing girl's pillowcase, a little white doll, one that looked like it had been stitched out of old rags. The police then held a press conference asking if anyone else's kid was in possession of one of these little white dolls. Only one set of parents came forward saying their little girl also had returned home from trick-or-treating with a little white doll in her candy bag, and that little girl just so happened to be my mom's best friend. I bet you thought I was going to say that little girl was my mom, didn't you? I can't blame you. And so did I when I first heard that story from her. But even so, she was half traumatized by the whole thing because not only did her friend and her parents almost have a nervous breakdown out of fear, but they also ended up moving out of town because their kid just couldn't feel safe there anymore. Mom said that she and everyone at school was convinced the man would come back in the middle of the night and snatch her up out of bed just like he'd done with that missing girl, who, by the way, was never found. No corpse or remains ever showed up anyplace. There were no credible witness sightings of her anywhere despite all the public appeals, and they didn't even find any articles of clothing or anything like that. It was like that little girl just vanished off the face of the earth, and that only gave credence to the theory, propagated by local kids, that the child snatcher had been some kind of boogeyman who targeted children with little white dolls on Halloween before eating them alive on the nights that followed. Obviously, that's not what happened, but it also wasn't like adults could tell their kids the whole truth. All they could say was that the girl was lost and that everyone hoped she'd come home safe one day. But no one believed that. Not really, anyway. In fact, a quick death would actually have been one of the more merciful options available, given the circumstances of a grown man abducting a little girl from her bed at night. I mean, again, it's unlikely the guy crept inside and snatched the kid kicking and screaming from her bed. The dolls were to win the kid's trust, so when the time came, they'd come quietly, not loudly, and go quietly she did because, as I said, no one found any trace of this girl or her abductor, and she was declared legally dead around the same time I graduated college. The town moved on, but no one forgot, especially the ones close to the whole thing, which explained why my mom got so scared when she emptied my bag of candy onto the table and saw a little white doll stitched out of old rags lying among the chocolate bar and candy wrappers. As you can imagine, she too rushed to call 911, and after the cops got a hold of the little white doll, the whole town basically went into lockdown while they searched for the person that might have placed it in my bag. No kid was allowed to go anywhere alone for days, and when the commotion died down, the cops said it was most likely some kind of copycat just looking to scare people. They figured it was probably some teenager who'd heard the story of the little white dolls, along with that of the girl who went missing just days after they were handed out. They didn't think they were seriously going to complete the copycat process and try to abduct any kids who received dolls. I wasn't the only one. But given the weight of police presence on the streets come November 1st, There was a good chance it was that and that alone which deterred the copycat from going through with it. I didn't hear the whole story until many years later, and while my dad thought the whole thing was dumb and that it was just kids being kids, it had quite a heavy effect on my mom, I guess because it brought back all those bad memories from her childhood. I mostly believe it was a copycat too, as in someone just playing a dumb prank, because no one ever tried to snatch any of us kids who got the dolls, not even years later, when sometimes I wonder how much of a prank it really was. If the whole town didn't take the dolls seriously, or the guy hadn't picked my candy bag to drop one into so that my mom didn't see it, would things have still happened the way they did? Or would have another kid have gone missing in the middle of the night, snatched up by the man who made the little white dolls?
Halloween has unfortunately never been a big deal out here in Scotland, and that's always bummed me out because I love Halloween. But after this year, I think I'll be happy never celebrating it again. My street and the next street over have a lot of young kids who go out trick-or-treating, so while I was out shopping all day with my mom, we decided to pick up some sweets in case anyone came to the door. I had plans to go to the cinema to see the new Ouija movie with my friend. So when I got home, I was getting myself ready to go out, and my mom was busy putting the shopping away. So when the first load of kids came to the door, I was the one who had to answer it. There were children from our street, the next one over, and the next one. Some I couldn't recognize, as well as an adult at the end of the path, who I guessed was either a father or an older brother. They were dressed in all black and had some sort of mask covering their face, but it wasn't anything I recognized from a movie or anything. Anyway, they had all told me their jokes and I gave them their treats as they made their way back down the path and onto the next house. I was about to close the door when I noticed that guy with the kids was still standing at the end of my path. I backed away slowly into the house as I watched him raise his hand and wave very slowly at me. I was about to call out to him when my mom came to the door to make sure I was alright, and he then took off in the opposite direction. He hadn't been with the children at all, and he left as soon as he realized that I wasn't home alone. I was completely freaked out by this and told my friend all about it when he came to the house to pick me up, but I quickly forgot all about it when we were watching the movie. When I finally got home, it was getting really late and trick-or-treating was well over at this point. I got inside and my mom was just getting ready to take the dogs out for a walk so that they could go do their last-minute business and that they would meet my dad on his way home from work, so I was going to be home alone. Anyway, so I was then home alone and grabbed some snacks and went up to my bedroom and onto my computer so that I could finish up some of my writing. After my first creepy encounter with the guys coming into my house and into my backyard, my dad then brought a motion sensor light and attached it to the wall of our house right outside my window. Normally, it will go off whenever a cat walks along our fence, but it will usually go off after a couple of minutes. I always know when the light has to come on because it lights up my whole room given where it's placed, and while I'm sitting at my computer, the light then came on. I felt my blood run cold when I looked out and saw the creep from hours before sitting on the fence, waving at my window to keep the light on. Luckily, I heard the front door open and my parents coming into the house with the dogs, so I rushed down the stairs and started screaming at them about the guy on the fence. My dad didn't question me. He just took the dogs and rushed through the house, threw the back door open and ran outside, and then I heard him shouting, "Get the hell out of here, you creep. I'm going to phone the police." My dad scared him off, but I convinced him not to call the police because I didn't want to make the whole situation worse. I just wanted to go to sleep and forget all about the whole night. Thankfully, I haven't seen the man since. This happened to me when I was 24 years old while home alone, primarily on Halloween night. During this time, I was still living with my parents as I was still a college student that didn't have a job with any money. My parents had to take my younger brother, who was around 10 at the time, to one of his friends' Halloween parties to have their fun. I had been invited to a Halloween party myself, but decided not to go as I'd came down with a mild fever earlier that day and didn't want to risk it going back up. Therefore, I was left at home to hand out candy for the trick-or-treaters, which I didn't mind even though some kids would be annoying. Throughout the night, I'd constantly be sitting on the couch, either playing some video games or watching Netflix, and would pause it once there was a knock at the door. Fast forward to around 10 p.m., Halloween started to die down. People stopped answering their doors and turning off all the lights until everyone was gone. Just as I was about to turn off the TV and get some shut-eye, I heard yet another knock at the door. In my mind, I thought it would be more of those pesky trick-or-treaters, but when I opened the door, I was greeted as someone who was at least 6'5", definitely not a kid. They had on what looked to be a zombie mask of some type, which I must admit was pretty creepy. The design was on point and the mask seemed very well detailed. I also noticed that he had a handgun sticking out of his back pocket, but at that point, I completely dismissed it as a prop. Hey there, happy Halloween, and proceeded to grab the bowl so he could take some candy. The only problem was that he either didn't acknowledge or care about the fact that he even said anything. In fact, I noticed that he didn't even have a candy bag with him. He just stood there motionless, slowly tilting his head to the side to, I guess, create more suspense. At this point, I'm a bit creeped out and told him that I had to go and to have a nice night, while closing the door and making sure it was locked. I looked through the peephole, and to my surprise, he was still standing by the stoop like a statue. I figured that it was probably some edgy teen playing a joke on people and that he'd eventually have to leave. And he did. An hour later, my parents had returned home with my brother and I decided to call it a night as I had class early the next morning. But there was yet another knock at the door, this time much more loud. I opened it and was greeted with two police officers with very serious looks. My dad then came to the door, and one of them had asked us if we had seen anyone come to our house with a mask and a concealed firearm. At first, I didn't know what they were talking about, but then I remembered about my encounter. Their description matched the person I saw almost perfectly, and it was no doubt him. They went on to explain that the person I saw supposedly murdered his girlfriend and had dumped her body in a nearby lake. He was put in a mental institution a few years back and was released on, quote, good behavior. My heart dropped into the pit of my stomach as they said this. A few days later, my mom found a letter in our mailbox that wasn't in any sort of envelope. Written in big bold letters were the words, "You made the right decision when you locked the door." In 2014, something happened to me on Halloween night that made me not ever want to celebrate it again. Halloween is supposed to be a fun and exciting experience that only happens once a year, and I've heard over the years that some unsettling and creepy things had happened. Kids finding sharp objects in their candy, people receiving candy only to find out they were actually drugs, and so on. Anyway, I was 10 years old and I was trick-or-treating with my two other friends under the supervision by my older brother who was 18. We had been trick-or-treating throughout the night, having a blast and enjoying ourselves. At one point, my candy bag, aka my pillowcase, was nearly filled to the brim with that addictive Halloween candy. By now, Halloween was practically dead, and the neighborhood was basically a ghost town when you looked at it. My other two friends, on the other hand, wanted to go to one last house on the block that had lots of decorations indicating that there was more candy. My brother went with them while I stayed on the other side of the street, when I hear what sounds like an engine. I look to my left to see an old soccer mom car coming down the street with its headlights turned off. The car slowly crept toward me, coming to a complete stop as it pulled up next to me. A man, I'd say in his mid-30s, rolled down the window and said the following. "Hey there, hun. My son and I were trick-or-treating and we lost our dog and can't find him. I'm sorry, but would you be my little helper and help us find him? It would really help me out. In my 10-year-old state, I assumed that he really did lose his dog, so I gladly accepted. Big mistake. As I'm walking toward the car, I noticed something through the passenger side window. Let me point out that it's completely dark out, and if it wasn't for the light from the moon, I wouldn't have seen him. There were 2 men in the car wearing masks looking straight at me through the tinted windows. All of a sudden, I see my brother and my friends come my way, and I let out a sigh of relief. As soon as the men see my 6'6" brother, they immediately floored down the road, never to be seen again. My brother told our parents about the incident, but I don't know what happened after that. Now that I'm much more older, I became a little more wise as to what actually happened.
On the evening of December 22nd, 1989, the Harris family of Dryden, New York, received the final visitor of their lives. One after the other, Tony Harris, his wife Dolores, and their 2 younger children were tied up, shot in the head, doused with gasoline, and then set alight. Their charred corpses were discovered the following morning, after a neighbor complained to the fire department about a smoke alarm going off on their property. Disturbingly, the police stated that the Harris' home showed no signs of forced entry, leading them to believe that their killer had either snuck in through an open door or maybe a window, but was highly unlikely, given the frigid outdoor temperatures, or that the killer was someone they knew and trusted. In light of how difficult it was to discern any kind of motive, the investigation into the murders quickly stalled, and local law enforcement reached out to the FBI for more extensive assistance. FBI agents discovered that a brown van had been taken from the Harris' family garage, one that was later discovered in a parking lot of a nearby mall. Police also declared that they wished to speak with a cyclist seen riding through the area shortly before nightfall on December 22nd. Frustratingly, not a single witness came forward, and this further slowed an already difficult investigation. Back at the Harris' home, Christmas wreaths and red ribbons had been joined by yellow crime scene tape. The family had moved there just 3 years prior, after Tony was offered a job at Deanco, a Syracuse-based electronic equipment distributor. His wife Dolores, or Dodie as she was known, was a popular figure in the neighborhood, frequently organizing bake sales and cookie exchanges while running a small crafts and gift shop out of the family home. The murders stunned the local community, with Tompkins County Sheriff Robert Howard stating that there hadn't been a murder in the area in a long time. Naturally, the Harris' neighbors were horrified by such a brutal slaying, who stated that their suburb of Ellis Hollow was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. For a horrific crime to happen there, something had to have gone very wrong. At the family's collective funeral, loved ones and neighbors described them as active and well-liked members of the community. "You can't think of anyone that would have a grudge against them," said Ann Parzale, a friend of Mrs. Harris. "People can't understand how it could happen. This is a very wholesome, family-oriented community. Those things aren't supposed to happen here, inside this community," added Edgar Clemens, who was a retired school teacher and had lived on Ellis Hollow Road for 26 years. "I don't think anybody around here slept Saturday night. I've opened the door to people whose cars have broken down. I don't think I'll do that anymore." Police quickly uncovered a suspect, however, an ex-con known as Michael Kinge, and set about tracking him down. Yet when they finally cornered him at his apartment complex, Kinge produced a shotgun, placed it under his chin, and threatened to kill himself. The cops held their fire, promising to bring in a trained negotiator in hopes of de-escalating the situation. But before that negotiator could arrive, Kinge aimed the shotgun at police officers and fired. Thankfully, the shot sent lead fragments spraying harmlessly above their heads, and law enforcement's return fire was considerably more accurate. But before he fell, Kinge turned the shotgun on himself, racked a shell into the chamber, and fired. The Tompkins County medical examiner found that the shots Kinge fired in his attempt at suicide had merely grazed the left side of his face, and it was the police's small caliber handgun ammunition that actually put him down. However, given the circumstances of Kinj firing a shot at them, his death was ruled a justifiable homicide. Obviously, Kinj was never put on trial for the murders, but his suicide by cops situation was seen by many as a tantamount to his admission of guilt. This was later confirmed when a sawed-off rifle found in the suspect's apartment was positively identified as the weapon used to kill the Harris family. Kinj's mother was wrongly convicted of being involved in the murders and ended up being a major police scandal. But aside from this horrifying miscarriage of justice, the really disturbing thing is that the motive behind the killings was never determined. No one knows why a small-time crook like Michael Kinj just suddenly snapped and chose the most wonderful time of the year for one of the most heinous crimes in history. I've known for a while that I wanted to submit this story, but I felt odd about it since I'm still friends with some of the guy's family and would feel like a total shitbag if it was ever seen. However, I've been home with the kids reading today and got pissed that I read all of your stories and was fresh out of creepy material. So to be part of the solution, I guess, here we go. I'm a member of the slam poetry scene. Basically, it's an excuse to get people to listen to a performance poetry by adding a competitive element to things. After running through the small scene in my city and wanting to branch out and push my career further, I started visiting places within driving distance that I could spit. This led me to Charlotte, North Carolina. I started on their local team venue, where you compete to be a part of a squad that goes to a national competition every year. I was doing well and was accepted into the local crew pretty readily. This led to longer stays and features at some of the other venues in the city. I started going to one that was particularly popular. It was good for selling CDs, and this is where I met this guy. He worked as a barback, occasionally got on stage and shared. Frankly, it was always shitty poems. He was the brother of the host and everyone knew and liked him. He began flirting with me more and more. Although in my loose days, searching for acceptance and love everywhere, something always kept me leery. I gladly accept the drinks he sent over, smoke his weed with the group in the stockroom between sets, and hang out at parties and other events. But I always had this tickle in my gut, warning me to not get close. But over a year or two, we continued to become friends. After a while, he started calling and texting me more often, poking me on Facebook daily, sending messages about wanting to be more than friends, and he wanted to find a snow bunny and settle down. Again, I never entertained it. There's just something gnawing at me. The crazy in his eyes was too hard to miss. Eventually, I moved to Denver to take a position teaching poetry and work at a friend's law firm. The second Christmas that I was there, I got a call. One of my friends from Charlotte relayed the following message. He'd found his white girl and gotten married. They seemed happy at first, but slowly began fighting more and more. It spilled over into the venue, and often they had to be separated by friends from physically attacking one another in public. One friend, later thinking back, remembers the last time that she saw them together. Him pushing his wife, following by her throwing a drink in his face, and scratching his neck deep enough to draw blood. She said after the couple had been dragged away from each other, she sat with him and smoked a cigarette. She says she laughed and said, "You guys are gonna kill each other." Around Christmas of last year, his wife stopped coming to the bi-weekly events they both attended regularly. He explained it away that they were on a break. Time goes by. No one really questions that they hadn't seen or heard from her in quite a while, thinking she was breaking from the whole scene in order to put distance between herself and her husband. Her parents, however, hadn't heard from their daughter since Thanksgiving dinner. They would call him, and he would say everything was fine and blow them off. This continues until a week after Christmas, knowing their daughter would never miss a holiday, at least without a call. They call the police and send them over to the couple's home for a well body check. The cops arrive. They knock on the door and are let in. They ask him where she is. He replies that she's still in the bedroom. He shows them to the room where she lay there, dead for weeks, rotting in their bed. Oh, and he killed her little dog too. During this time, he'd been attending events, hosting hip-hop nights, and even publishing a blog on making a marriage work on one of the local organization sites, never once letting on that every night he was going home and sleeping with his murdered wife. The sickest part of all of this, he is a child from another relationship, a daughter whom he gets to celebrate with every other holiday. That Christmas, they opened gifts, had dinner, cuddled up on the couch, and watched movies, less than 100 feet from her decaying stepmother. I don't know what would have happened if I'd ever taken him up on the offer to date. But I do know me and my gut are going to stay on speaking terms, and I will always listen to it. This happened in December of 2011 when I was on a college semester break. I grew up in rural Texas with about 1,000 people in my hometown. Shortly after my parents divorced, I moved to a larger city for college and made it a tradition every year to visit my family for the holidays in the boonies of Texas. After the divorce, my mom had recently moved to a nearby town, only 100 people, where her house was located. It was on the very outskirts of town, surrounded by miles and miles of cornfields in almost every direction. There was a side paved road that was about 100 feet off of her house that basically was a dead end until you reached a certain point. Then directly across the other side of the road was in fact miles of fields of corn. The only neighbor that she had was half a mile north of her house, who was a truck driver and was basically never home much of the year. I'm telling you all of this so you know how secluded my mother's house really truly was. The closest town from here was 15 to 20 miles away. This winter break was different because my mother and brother were going to travel to Boston to visit my grandparents. My mom needed someone to sit the dog. After a few days of having the house to myself in the middle of nowhere, I'm getting kind of bored. So I decide to put the harness on my dog and take a walk out into the area in no particular direction. We end up following that dead-end road and then turn back as it starts to get darker. The wind's picking up because a cold front was coming through. At this time, I'm slightly more frustrated with myself because I could start to smell the rain. And my dog can be particularly stubborn. He likes to walk me instead of the other way around. Anyway, as we start walking back, it's getting colder and colder. Now it's drizzling, and I'm walking a bit faster. We're damn near almost to a jog, heading back to the house, when all of a sudden, my dog stops abruptly. Initially, I just think it's him being stubborn, but he starts leading me in the direction of the cornfield. I'm thinking this is one of those cases where he just locks onto a scent and just cannot let it go until he directly goes up to it, or I have to pick him back up and lead him back on track. I don't allow him to get very far, and we're directly in front of the fields. And then all of a sudden, he starts barking, similar to how he barks when he sees another person, and he's not friendly to other people. I finally get tired of all this. I pick him up and we run back home, both now damp and cold. Once back inside, I dry up and take a bath. It's now evening time. I make something to eat, and my dog and I start winding down for the night. We watch a bit of TV in the living room, and by 10 p.m., we call it for the night. It's still very much windy outside this time though, and that storm never really died down. We go into the bedroom. My dog burrows underneath the blankets, and I pass out shortly after. Several hours later, I wake up to my dog growling on my bed in the direction of the window. I hear rustling outside, and I think it's likely just another animal, but I'm still kind of drowsy, so I get out of bed and pick up my dog to corral him to the living room, where I turn on the TV to drown out those rustling noises. My dog burrows underneath the blankets again, and I'm just about to fall asleep when I hear a thud outside. I'm like, what the hell was that? And of course, my dog is now wide awake again, barking and growling underneath the blankets. I'm wide awake now. I'm getting annoyed with my dog. I turn up the TV, trying to drown out all those noises outside once again. 25 minutes later, at 1:30 a.m., I hear a knock on the back door. Now all hell breaks loose with my dog. He's literally about to jump off the couch and dash to the door. I caught him last minute, and just to hold him in place while we're both freaking out. I'm hoping to God that I didn't hear that, hoping that it was just my imagination. My dog started to calm down. I'm thinking maybe I did imagine that. Maybe I blacked out. Maybe there's a period of time where I just don't remember anything. Shortly thereafter, I don't hear any more rustling leaves coming from outside. My dog goes back to being silent and burrows underneath the blankets once more. Cue the doze off to slumberland, only to wake up 30 minutes later to another knock, but now it's on the front door. I literally feel my heart pumping so damn fast. I grab the landline and dial 911. My dog is now at the front door barking ferociously. I reach the adjacent town's 911 emergency service and frantically state what's all happening and why my dog is freaking out. The police from the adjacent town was on their way, but it was going to take a while to get to my house. I stay on the phone with the dispatcher and things start to calm down again. And I tell them that I'm pretty sure I can handle it from here at least until the police arrive. I hang up and very carefully look out the side window, only to see a man standing directly in front of the door. No movement from him at all, just a blank stare at the door. I grab the mace and my dog and state very loudly to him, the police are on their way. I get no response back. I'm thinking this guy has to be on drugs at this point. I end up going to the front door. I yank it open, and the doors in this house have a secondary door with a windowed screen. It's locked and would take some effort to get inside because the screen is triple pane. I look into his face and ask what the hell he wants. Told him the police are about to be here. He just stares blankly, paused for what must have been the longest 20 seconds of my life, opens up his mouth and asks if I want to play a game with him. After that, I immediately shut the door and yell back ferociously, absolutely not. I waited in the bedroom, watched him on my front porch for about 5 minutes, just staring blankly at the door. No movement whatsoever. He finally turns around and just walks away. 20 minutes later, the cops show up. I'm describing everything frantically to them. I literally peed my pants earlier. That's how terrifying everything was. The cops then basically state that there's a guy in my town that has schizophrenia and is going through late stages of Alzheimer's, and sometimes he wanders around people's house. Needless to say, they found him and took him back to his caretakers. They asked if I had anywhere else to go, and I basically packed everything up and bolted to my father's house with my dog, and then stayed there for the remainder of the break. I always tell people that bartending isn't as glamorous as they think. Sure, you've got your free drinks and your regulars who tip big if you keep their glasses full, but it's a grind. Long hours of drunk people spilling their life stories all over you. Constant hum of music and chatter that almost drills into your skull. When I was younger, it was a pretty decent gig. It paid the bills and kept my fridge stocked. Gave me enough extra to feel like I wasn't just scraping by. But to me, it was never really more than that. It was just a job. The worst part though, at least in my opinion, was the holidays. We didn't get to skip out on Christmas, New Year's, or even the other days that most people spent with their families. The bar still opened, and somebody had to be there to sling drinks for those who didn't have anywhere else to go, or didn't want to. We tried to spread the misery around, divvying up the shifts so nobody got stuck with all those crappy days, but it was still a roll of the dice. And that year, you guessed it, my number came up for Christmas. "Just think about the tips," my boss said with a grin, handing me the schedule. I gave a fake smile back, but my jaw was clenched so hard, I thought my teeth might crack. The truth was, the tips didn't make up for it. Christmas at the bar was this weird mix of festive and depressing. We decorated the place with tinsel and those cheap string lights that blinked like they were on their last leg. The TVs playing old Christmas movies with the volume low, while a mix of holiday classics and rock ballads blared out from the jukebox. We even had a few peppermint-themed drink specials that nobody ever wanted. The crowd that came in was always pretty predictable, mostly regulars, the same old guys who occupied the same stools every week, nursing their beers and swapping stories about when life was better. But Christmas would always bring a few wild cards. The lonely ones, looking for somewhere to go or somebody to talk to. They'd wander in with red noses and wide eyes, clinging to their coats like they'd been outside just long enough to lose all their warmth. I tried to not think about what it all meant, being here instead of, well, anywhere else. Just keep my head down, pour a few drinks, and watch the clock crawl towards closing time. When I noticed the guy at the far end of the bar, he was half hidden in the shadows, and I don't remember seeing him come in, but there he was, staring at me like he was waiting for me to do something. "Doing okay over there?" I called out, forcing a smile. He didn't answer me, just tilted his head slightly. The night dragged on. The usual lull that followed the initial holiday rush. People were drinking slowly now, most of them looking at their watches, ready to leave to go wherever the night was going to take them. But that man didn't move. He continuously watched me from the end of the bar, and it was starting to get under my skin. His eyes almost seemed to never leave me, dark and unreadable. I kept busy, wiping the counter down, pouring drinks, and trying my best not to glance over at him. But it was like he was pulling my attention and forcing it back to him. I tried to brush it off, but the longer I worked, the more uncomfortable I started to feel. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Can I get you anything else?" I asked, setting the glass down that I'd been cleaning. His voice was low and there was an edge to it. "You got any of that special drink you were talking about earlier, the peppermint one?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "We got a few, they're on the specials menu." He gave a single nod and still didn't break eye contact. I turned away to fix it. The feeling of his gaze stayed with me though, gnawing at the back of my neck. I handed him the drink, but he didn't move to take it. Instead, he just sat there, staring. "You're not gonna tell me what's really going on, are you?" he said. I paused, my hand still hovering near his glass. I blinked and was completely unsure of how to respond to him. "Excuse me?" "I know something about you," he said, leaning forward just slightly. "You don't belong here. Not tonight." I forced out a laugh. It's just a job. I'm here like everybody else." He didn't laugh with me. His head tilted again. The rest of the night seemed to pass in a blur. The bar cleared out and just a few of the regulars were left, nursing their drinks. Occasionally I would steal glances at the man, but he never took his eyes off me. Every time I turned, I felt his gaze follow. He had not moved from that spot, but I had this distinct feeling that he really wasn't sitting anymore. He was waiting. By the time I finished cleaning up, the place was almost empty, save for a few people who were still finishing their drinks. I locked up and hit the lights and grabbed my coat. That cold hit me immediately as I stepped outside. My car was parked near the back of the lot, half buried underneath fresh snow. I had planned to call for a tow truck, but I thought better of it. It's Christmas Eve. I didn't want to bother anybody on a night like this, so I just figured I'd walk home. My walk really isn't that long. It's only about 1.5 miles, but in the freezing cold with the snow biting at my skin, it would feel like an eternity. The streetlights flickered in the distance. The world felt quiet. As I reached that first intersection, I checked both ways. No cars, no movement. The street was still, just like the rest of the city. I took a quick breath and stepped onto the crosswalk. And that's when I heard footsteps. At first, they seemed distant, almost like I wasn't sure what I was hearing, especially with the wind howling and the snow crunching beneath me. When I turned, I saw him. There he was again, the man from the bar. I froze. He was walking in my exact footsteps, keeping pace. His head was down and his breath was rising up in clouds. I quickened my pace, the heels of my boots clicking against the pavement faster now. But when I looked back, he had closed the distance. I glanced around. No cars, no businesses. The street was empty. It was just me and him. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaky. "The hell do you want from me?" He didn't answer me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I walked faster. He was still behind me, matching every step. I was almost home now, though. Just a few more blocks. But then I heard him shout. "You don't belong here," he yelled, his voice harsh and twisted. "You never did." I was close enough now that I could see my house at the end of the block. His footsteps were still behind me, closing in, and I could swear that I heard his breath now, heavy and shallow. Before I could make a move, I felt his hand on my shoulder. My scream was in my throat, but it caught in my chest as I was shoved hard against the cold brick of a building. His breath was hot against my ear. his body pressing in close around me. "Please," I gasped, struggling to free myself. "Get off me, what do you want?" I got no response, only his grip tightened, and for a moment I thought this was it. I would be left out here in the dark, no one to help and no one to stop him. And that's when I heard another shout. I looked up, trying to focus through my panic. Across the street, I saw 3 men walking toward me, their eyes wide with alarm. They were carrying something, cases, musical equipment maybe. They set them down in the snow and quickly rushed toward us. "Get off her!" one of the men yelled, his voice deep and pretty commanding. The man who'd been holding me stepped back and muttered something under his breath. He turned and quickly ran down an alley before the trio of men could even reach me. Those men stayed with me as I shakily called the police. They were kind, offered reassurance while they kept their eyes on the alley. It felt like forever before the police finally showed up, and when they did, they couldn't really find any trace of the man. I still didn't feel safe, even with them there. Those men insisted on escorting me home, making sure that I got inside without any more incident. When I finally closed that door behind me, I breathed a sigh of relief, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The man had seen something in me, and something that I couldn't quite explain. But thankfully, I never saw him again.
So something very strange happened to me a few years ago. Because I can't tell it without giving away some identifiable information, I can't say exactly where it happened, but it was a major US city. I don't think I'm in any danger from telling this story, I just have a very good reason to be cautious. I've been furloughed during the 2020 pandemic, and my stimulus check was starting to run out. I'd split up with my boyfriend because living together in lockdown had revealed that he was a massive Jordan Peterson guy, and before I blocked him on Facebook, I think he was getting into QAnon. So I was starting to get worried about money. I'd got into a routine of waking up and making some black coffee and then checking all the job listing sites for remote work. When nothing turned up, I'd usually hit one of the few gyms that were still open. Working out made me feel like that I still had some control over my body. And that day was different though, because before I could open my crossword app, I saw a Facebook message about an exciting new job opportunity with flexible hours and daily earnings up to $1,000. It was a multi-level marketing scheme to sell overpriced makeup. I blocked and reported them for scams and thought that that would be the end of it. There was a new girl at the gym that day, but she seemed to be more interested in her phone than working out, probably trying to choose the right selfies to post. I tried to ignore her and worked on my arms. After showering and changing into a strappy top and leggings, I went to the nearby Starbucks for a frappe. There were some more scam messages, which I didn't even bother reading this time before blocking them, and there must have been about 5 different accounts, all with the same kinds of messages and the same profile photo of a woman in her 30s with lip fillers and pretty good eye makeup. It was about this point when I realized that she was in the coffee shop, only about 3 tables away. I froze. I went to that gym almost every day. I was in the Starbucks nearly as often, and she had to have seen me here, probably got my name from them calling out for my drink orders and guessed the rest on Facebook. And this was no coincidence. Another terrible thought struck me. I googled the makeup brand, 0 results. And that kind of company is almost built on search engine optimization. There was no way that it would have had a digital footprint. And like most people, I didn't know much about multi-level marketing companies. The scale at which most of the recruiters message people is a little frightening, and you're told to find up to hundreds of people each day and tell them their unique qualities make them suited to the MLM. So when I found out that the MLM company wasn't even real, it made a lot more sense how she'd had the time to do so much research on me. I later found out from friends and ex-coworkers that she'd been messaging them, asking questions about me and just giving a very weird vibe. I was so shocked that I almost ran out of the coffee shop. And of course, she followed me after taking a sip from my unfinished drink. I asked her what the hell she was doing, and in the end, It turned out to be about a man that I'd just forgotten about. She claimed I'd stolen her ex, and in reality, he'd never told me that he was in a relationship, and when he proved to be useless in every way that mattered, I ended it. The next week, I'd seen him with another woman, and I barely even cared. I didn't steal her boyfriend, and she would have been better off without him. I tried to tell her as much, but she was clearly obsessed with me now, and it didn't really matter how she'd started. It felt very strange trying to run away from her without wanting to make it obvious that something weird was happening, and as if by not showing it, I could avoid the situation that I was in. She didn't seem to care about that, so I was forced to run away from her. Not sure where else to go, I ran for the subway with her not far behind. And I thought back to my wilder teenage years as I cleanly jumped over the turnstile, leaving her scrambling to pay the fare. And I ran down the platform and jumped through the subway car doors and tried to make my way along the packed train. Just as the doors were closing, she made it into the car, and I waved at her as the train started to move and walked back up the steps to get a cab home. I don't have my name on any social media accounts now, and I deleted most of them. Even if you could work out who I am from this, you'll never find me online. I don't really take selfies anymore, not on any public accounts, and of course I got multiple restraining orders on her, but I still don't want to take any chances. Unless she's gotten the help she needs, then she's probably stalking someone else right now. I have a very close friend who tells me I need to move because I resent having to keep a file on my own stalker. And I'm only writing this because I think if she escalates again, that she might get caught. I'm from Old Blighty, and I've got a proper corker of a yarn to share with you today, old chap. Just kidding, we don't actually talk like that, but that was the first message I received from the girl that I'll call Handcuffs. She said that she'd seen my MySpace and liked my photography and thought it was funny that I came from Old Blighty. She was fascinated by British slang and British culture and kept making weird British jokes to me, calling me old chap and that kind of stuff. And I found it pretty enduring that a hot alternative Californian chick was impressed by my Britishness, and I figured the rumor was true, that American chicks dig British guys despite our awful teeth and love of bland cuisine. And I was even more impressed when Handcuffs told me the site that she'd worked for. You can't actually say the name on YouTube, but let's just say that it's a modeling site that still exists to this day, which could be known as Unalive Lasses, if you catch my drift. And you probably get it by now. Handcuffs told me that she was an unalive lass, and sent some photos that did indeed suggest that she was such. And I could see her on the public version of the website, but a number of the photos were definitely from the paying members only area, if you catch my drift. And of course it didn't really occur to my dumb hormone-fueled self that someone could have just subscribed to the site to save those photos and send them to me. The inclusion of some candid personal photos sealed the deal for me, and again, stupid as I am, I didn't really consider that whoever Handcuffs really was, they could have just found other photos of this unalive lass who was a public figure. Me and Handcuffs talked for a while, and then she confessed her love for me. And I believed this, obviously, because I was an arrogant little sod who thought that I was a great catch for a Californian glamour model. And I started getting more suspicious, however, when she became dead set on flying me out to Cali to meet her. And that seemed too good to be true, but hey, what's the worst that could happen? A free trip to California? Then she said that because of the way the exchange rate works, she could only buy a ticket from the UK to California using GBP, and her bank account didn't allow her to exchange dollars for pounds. Therefore, I'd have to send her the ticket price in pounds, and she'd send it back in dollars. And she knew my bank account would automatically convert it because Lloyd's Bank did that apparently. Why a Californian unalive lass was supposed to have insight into the functions of Lloyd's Bank is something I'll never know. But hey, at least it was a good tell that started to open my eyes. I asked her if she could possibly send the money first because I was a little strapped for cash after getting my Peugeot modded. At first she said that was fine and even claimed that she'd done an international transfer, so I should send the money over in the meantime and her transfer would appear in my account later. Yeah, no thanks. I told her I'd have to wait until her transfer came through, and she started ranting about how I didn't really love her, and how I wasn't gonna get some if I didn't make the effort and try to appeal to my, baser instincts. And as much as I wanted to believe that I'd be sinking into the bed of an unalive lass, I also wanted to believe that I'd have money to live, so I told her that I genuinely could not send the money back until I had it. Of course, no money showed up, and then she surprised me by saying it was fine. She'd managed to buy the ticket anyway, so I didn't need to worry about the money. I asked her if the plane tickets would be arriving at my house, and she said no. She hadn't been able to arrange that, so I'd have to pick them up from the airport on the day of the flight. I told her that I'd prefer to have the ticket in hand before driving all the way down to Heathrow, or at the very least, could she email me the receipt for the ticket so I knew everything was kosher. And again, she flipped out at this, screaming over instant messenger and hurling some of the worst written abuse I think I'd ever seen in my life. Hell, at this point I didn't even care if she was genuine, Californian hot girl or not. Never stick your head in crazy, as they say. And so I told her to have a nice life, blocked her, and moved on thinking that I was no worse for wear. I did kind of miss her, or miss the things that I'd imagined getting up to with her, but it was whatever. And a few days later I was strolling through town with a couple of the boys when I heard a female voice yelling my name with some absolute venom. I turned to look, and an ex-girlfriend from year 8 came bounding across the high street. Lucy was a large Wiccan girl who had been a smaller, quiet girl when we dated. We just kind of drifted apart after just a few weeks, simply not vibing, and I'd never even thought about her since. We were in 6th form college now, and I saw her around at times, often being quite loud and mouthy, and was always glad that I dodged a bullet with that one. And now she was storming over to me, swinging her big woolen black bag, pentagrams jangling around her neck, mascara smeared around her eyes. And she came up to me and jabbed me in the chest with a porky finger, hollering at me that I had no idea what I'd missed out on, and that I'd regret not paying her what I owed her for the heartbreak. She began screeching that she was going to put a spell on me and my friends, and that my genitals would fall off. Then she mentioned a few things that only handcuffs would know, and that's when I realized. Handcuffs was Lucy, my weird Wiccan ex-girlfriend from year 8, and I'd been successfully and decisively catfished by this crazy bitch. My mates would give me the ribbing of a lifetime about this later, but right now Lucy seemed genuinely unhinged and dangerous. She was talking as if she genuinely believed that she was handcuffs, and had at least summoned or manifested her, and that if I'd just sent her the money to pay her rent, then everything would have been forgiven and we could have gone back to being in love. I asked her what needed forgiving, and she said the fact that I broke up with her. In year 8, lady, like 5 years ago, and we just drifted apart, so I yelled at her, and it absolutely broke her brain. Lucy full-blown leaped on me, slamming me to the floor, and I felt my head hit the side of a granite bench as I fell, and blood began to trickle from my skull. And on top of that, I could feel tiny, sharp pains in my chest as she began to stab me over and over repeatedly with a safety pin. It was more annoying than agonizing, and coupled with the crack in my skull, things were starting to feel very serious. I felt my friends dragging Lucy off me, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital. Lucy had accidentally fractured my damn skull when she'd pushed me, and I had a massive bleed on my brain. My chest was also really sore from being stabbed by a damn safety pin, and my parents told me that Lucy was absolutely mortified about nearly killing me. Lucy's parents were insisting that she went into a voluntary rehab stint. Apparently she'd been pretty heavy into drugs and alcohol, and this was a wake-up call for her. And it was up to me if I pressed charges, and ultimately I decided not to. But that is the story of how I got catfished, stalked, and almost killed by a fake unalive lass who almost unalived me. For a bit of a happy ending, Lucy went through a stint at rehab and got better. We're not close or anything, but she's a mother of 2 and a fitness instructor now and living her best life. We keep in touch sporadically, though, for class reunions and stuff, and she has an incredibly dark sense of humor like I do, so we're able to joke about her almost killing me. In fact, it was her idea that I write this up, and she proofread and signed off on it. Some of the more damning descriptions of her were added by her, and she said that I should send it to a True Scary Stories channel, and so I settled on sending it to my favorite lad who would never catfish anyone. Let's read. So I've been a listener for a long time, and I've come into your live streams sometimes, and I'm ashamed to say that I've left a few comments laughing at some of the submitting authors for being idiots. I've always felt a bit guilty about it because deep down I know that I'm just projecting. As about 8 years ago, I got myself into a situation with a weird internet creeper, and I know it really was my own doing. I guess it's easier to take out my frustrations on others than admit fault. My friend Allison warned me about this guy named Jeff. And yeah, it was my own stupid fault. I admit that up front. And Allison told me, "Hey Shan, I met this guy on such and such Facebook group, and he started being all weird and intense with me." And she told me he was into swords and horror and all sorts of edgelord things. She told me that Jeff had mentioned me a few times and that he thought I was interesting. She said she thought he'd been trying to hit me up next. And she was right, he did. And my bored, stupid self, against my better judgment, allowed him to strike up a conversation with me. If you've ever been on the internet at all anytime between the 2000s and the late 2010s, you'll know guys like Jeff. Intense, serious, quick-to-anger anime fans who love The Killing Joke, Sin City, Firefly, and Arma. They hate the MCU and any mainstream superhero thing. They claim to be huge comic book fans, but get all their information from the Nolan Batman movies. They're an embarrassment to genuine comic book fans and nerds and people who understand why the Joker actually is a cool character, instead of why meme lord incels think he is. True ones understand. And Jeff was not a true one. His favorite game of all time was BioShock Infinite, and this is not to insult that game, but it is relevant and will come up later. And when Jeff started talking to me, it wasn't actually as bad as I expected. He was surprisingly fairly interesting. He had a rudimentary interest in the same things I did, the same comics, movies, anime, and video games. And at first, the cracks didn't show. But then the more he talked about these things, the clearer it became that he was getting all his information from probably Wikipedia or a handful of movie adaptations. He'd make definitive, sweeping statements about media that was just completely wrong or misinformed. For example, he went on about how Batman was his favorite superhero because all of his rogue gallery was totally grounded and normal, nothing weird or comic booky. And this was only true in the movie adaptations, but to an OG Batman comics fan, it's a ridiculous thing to say. I made the mistake of pointing this out to him, and he got super mad and started yelling at me that the comics didn't really count, Weird. Now, I only knew Jeff online, thank God, but every time I'd come online, I'd find lengthy messages from him. After just a week of knowing him, he'd write elaborate essays about how close we were and how much I meant to him and how grateful he was to know someone like me. We had known each other for probably a week at that point. The close friendship he'd imagined in his head soon seemed to sway towards the suggestion of a relationship. I had absolutely no romantic interest in this guy and had made it very clear to him that I wasn't looking, but it was like he heard what he wanted to hear. Multiple times he tried to impress me by crowing on about how he had to break the heart of his last girlfriend because she wanted to sleep with him, and he'd lectured her about how that was inappropriate. When I asked why it was inappropriate, he let slip that he, in his early 30s, had been dating a 16-year-old girl. Not just online either. They were dating in person. And he very smugly told me that he wouldn't sleep with her because it was illegal, though, and she was a bad person for wanting to get with him. Okay, buddy. That's the child at fault for sure, I bet. And this is when I decided that I didn't really want to be friends with this weirdo anymore. And one time I told him I was sick and that I wouldn't be online for a while. And after 5 days of frantic messages from him, I kind of snapped and said, "Dude, I was sick." And he kept replying saying, "I knew it. I just knew it." And then proceeded to ramble on about how we had a freaking psychic connection and how he had the same thing with his beloved grandmother and could always tell when something was wrong with a loved one, so he had simply been able to tell that I wasn't okay. Oh right, it was a psychic connection and not the fact that I literally told you 5 days ago. Next, when I wouldn't reply, he began sending me messages saying that he was having severe chest pains and then narrating his journey to the emergency room and leaving vague hints that he had only hours or minutes left to live. The first time, I stupidly fell for it, and then he would simply do it every time he wanted attention. But there was never any follow-up to these medical disasters. An absolute clown man. And when that stopped working, he began to spin sob stories about various elderly relatives he lived with who were on death's door. The problem was, he couldn't remember the stories that he'd spun. So one month it was his beloved granddad who'd raised him who was dying, but the next month it was his grandmother, and then it was his brother, and then his dad, and none of them ever actually did die, and most of them never even got mentioned again. It also contradicted the fact that he previously told me that he lived with a roommate who stole a ton of money off of him but still lived with him, and also that he lived alone. It was just completely nonsensical gibberish, all designed to evoke sympathy. He'd write lengthy attention-seeking diatribes on Facebook about how everyone he knew always wanted to take from him, and how he was an untapped well of positivity and generosity, who was literally incapable of being mean, that he genuinely had some kind of condition that meant that he couldn't be unpleasant to people. And yet somehow he was always managing to condemn women and girls for their behavior, choice of dress, etc., or calling other people fake fans of things he liked, even though he had the most rudimentary understanding of most things. And eventually, it all became too much for me. He'd go on these rants about how desire was disgusting and inappropriate, but also keep trying to hit on me. He'd send me random poorly lit photos of himself. Nothing risque even, just weird photos of him in a hat, and then ask for lengthy opinions on how good he looked, and if he felt like I hadn't said enough, he'd just keep pressing and pressing. Now again, let me stress that I met this guy online for about 6 weeks, and in the end, I told him that things were way too intense for me, and that while I'd be happy to try a friendship with him, we just didn't have the same kind of relationship where we were actually close BFFs or more like he seemed to keep insisting. This was of course my fault, and he lost it with me, getting ragey and angry at the fact that I'd said that I was willing to be his friend. Now why would I say that if I wasn't? I tried to explain to him that being someone's friend doesn't involve constant trauma-dumping, attention-seeking, and claims of psychic bonds. But he was having none of it. He started swearing and cursing at me, so I blocked him. Later, he messaged me on Steam apologizing for what he was about to do. It wasn't clear whether he was going to do something to himself or to me. I wasn't too concerned about the latter, though. We lived in totally different countries, and he was far too broke to fly here and do anything to me. Of course, nothing came of it because guys like him are all terror and bluster, and instead, he posted a huge rant on Facebook about how if you have a beautiful songbird in a cage, it's your duty to let her fly free. It was a quote from BioShock Infinite, and he decided I was Elizabeth from BioShock and he was, I don't know, her dad? Yeah, way to make it even more creepier, pal. It was a pretty terrifying experience, even if I can look back on it and laugh at him. Having someone that toxic in your life is horrible, and I severely learned my lesson about believing people like this are interesting. And I hope the same can be said for my third friend who decided to befriend Jeff even after all of what I'd told her. And last I heard, she'd cut him off because he was trying to convince her to cheat on her husband with him. Back when I was still in college, I used to drive home for the holidays, and since my parents lived all the way across the country, The journey took a day and a half and included an overnight stop in a motel. It was one of those single-story L-shaped places that looked like it had been around since the 50s or something, where the rooms opened directly onto the parking lot. The paint was fading. It had 2 buzzing neon signs out front that you could hear at night, and since the place was clean and cheap and was mostly exactly a 10-hour drive from college, I figured it was as good a place as any to get some needed sleep. Now, during my sophomore year, I pulled in and paid cash for a room and then parked right in front of my door. I dumped my overnight bag inside, checked the room over to make sure everything was as it should be, and then walked back outside to my car. But as I was locking my door, someone came up to the room next to mine. It was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, and since she was looking down at her phone as she walked past, she slammed into me as she did so. I was about to mumble sorry out of reflex, but she beat me to speaking. Not to offer an apology of her own, but to call me a dumb effing B-word who should watch where she's standing. It was so insane that I was stunned, and I didn't let it bother me. And as I walked to my car, I kind of laughed to myself at how comically terrible some people can be. I also remember being super relieved that I was only staying one night and that I most likely wouldn't have to interact with her again. I had no idea that me and Little Miss Rude were in for a much more significant encounter. I drove down to the same fried chicken place that I stopped by during my freshman year and was relieved to find that it was still open. I got myself a sandwich, some fries, and an iced tea, and then, after back out into the parking lot, I spotted a man standing by what I assumed was his car. It looked like he was watching the people inside through the big panel windows. The second he saw me, he called out in a friendly voice, asking if I could help him. Then when I asked what was going on, he told me his story. So about a week prior, his wife's parents had died in a freak car accident. She was absolutely devastated, but as the days went by, she got worse and worse, until one day, when she seemed to have a complete nervous breakdown and drove off in her car after saying she was going to find her dead parents, like she didn't really believe they were gone. Given what a fragile state of mind his wife was in, the man said he was desperate to find her before she got herself hurt or into trouble. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to show me a picture of her, and when he turned the screen around so I could see, I recognized who it was. It was Little Miss Rude, the lady who barged into me outside my motel room maybe only 45 minutes prior. I took a long look at the picture, staying quiet while I studied it, and then after looking up to meet the man's eyes, I told him, "Nope, sorry, haven't seen her. But if you give me your cell number, I can call you if I do." And I tried to sound as genuine as possible, took down his cell number before wishing him luck, and then walked back to our cars as he thanked me for my kindness. Now, a lot of you are going to ask, why the hell did you just lie to that nice man searching for his wife? And I get it. I'd be asking the same thing if it was me reading this right now. But right as I was on the cusp of telling the guy, "Good news, I know where she is. She's in the hotel room right next to mine," I heard my friend Allie's voice in my head. Allie, who'd been one of my best friends all throughout high school, had suffered through a horrible dating experience back when she was a senior. She ended up dating an older guy, not by much, just a couple of years. But while this guy seemed cool and had a nice car and had money to spend on her, he turned out to be an absolute psycho who could not take no for an answer. She had to quit her job and find one someplace else because he kept showing up trying to either yell at her or beg her to take him back. But just a few months into working at the new place, he showed up there too, and this time, he didn't want to talk. He tried dragging her into his car. The cops were called, it was a whole thing, but then afterwards, when one of her old middle school friends heard about it, she called her in tears saying the whole thing was her fault. The ex-boyfriend had reached out to her, told her a bunch of lies about organizing a surprise party, and then managed to trick her into spilling the beans regarding Allie's new place of work. It was cruel, devious, and manipulative, illustrating exactly why she'd had to break up with him in the first place. So when that guy showed me a picture of his wife, after telling me a bunch of stuff I had no way to verify, I figured that I better play it safe. It wasn't just Allie's experience that made me lie to him either. There was something about the way he told his story that just didn't sit right with me. It sounded almost rehearsed, and while I'd obviously help the guy out if his story turned out to be true, it's always better to be safe than sorry. When I got back to the motel, I went straight to the door of the room next to mine and then hesitated a few moments before finally knocking. I saw the curtains twitch to the right of me and then suddenly heard little Miss Rude yell, "What do you want?" She didn't sound mad or crazy, just a little annoyed that I'd knocked on her door, sure, but nothing like the nervous breakdown her husband had described. When I told her I had something to ask her, and it was better to ask face to face, she came to the door and opened it just a crack before peering out at me from the dark inside. She then asked me again in a much lower voice what business I had knocking at her door. Now, I didn't quite know what to say at first, or rather, I didn't quite know how to say it. So instead, I just asked her a question in the form of, "Ma'am, did your parents pass recently?" Now, she just screwed up her face before telling me no. Her father had died many years before, and her mother was still very much alive. It feels tasteless to say this given the circumstances, but that vindication, that confirmation that I was right to withhold information, it felt great. I hadn't been paranoid, and my suspicions had been entirely correct. And the lady still had a confused look on her face, so I quickly told her about the man that I met in the parking lot of that chicken place, and how he'd showed me a photograph of her. And the second I said it, her face just dropped and turned white. But not just in shock or realization, she looked more like I'd told her the dead were rising from their graves. She looked terrified, and after a few moments of silence, she told me, "Can you come inside?" And after she shut the door behind us, the first thing she did was thank me, and I witnessed a total shift in this woman's demeanor. She went from rude and antisocial to sweet and vulnerable as she explained that she'd recently escaped from her abusive husband. It wasn't just arguments or bad tempers, but years of steadily escalating violence. Then, by the time she got scared he might beat her to death, she knew it was time to go, and she slipped away while he was at work with nothing but a case of clothes, some cash, and her car. Hearing about all the abuse she went through made my skin crawl, and when I told her I'd lied to him about not seeing her, she looked so relieved that I thought she might cry. I also told her about taking his cell number and joked about how I could misdirect him with a false sighting. Now, this was the first time I actually saw her smile, and she laughed weakly before warning me not to get involved. Then, after thanking me a dozen more times, I went back to my room and got ready for bed. I went to sleep feeling good, like I'd done something truly special in helping a battered spouse avoid her abusive husband. But a couple of hours later, I hear this crash that had me bolting out of bed, terrified. And because in that moment I had major sleepy brain, I initially thought that what I'd heard was a car accident on the highway outside, but I didn't even make it over to the window before I heard another bang. And it was coming from the room next door, the one with little Miss Rude, or as she should really be called, the wife on the run. I dialed 911 on speaker as I threw on some clothes, telling them what was going on before heading out the door into the parking lot. I hadn't seen the husband yet, but I didn't need to. I knew only one man in the world could be responsible for the things she'd screamed, and the only one who would have replied in the way he did. Once I was dressed, I ran out into the parking lot just in time to see the same man from the chicken place parking lot. He had her by the arm, and he was dragging his escaped wife toward a pickup truck. He was dragging her, but she wasn't on her feet. She was unconscious, her legs scraping against the gravel, and the sight of her rag doll like that made me feel sick. I started yelling and screaming for him to let her go, for people to help her, and before long, a couple of other motel guests came out of their rooms. One of them, a big guy in flannel pajama pants, ran straight toward them and shouted for him to let go. Another man from further down the road joined in. The husband swung at one of them, but in the chaos, a third man came at him from the side and shoved him so hard he let go of his wife. After that, he seemed to realize just how outnumbered he was, and after running to his truck, he peeled out of that lot and zoomed off down the highway. Someone had already called the police and another guest was on the phone with 911 for an ambulance, and the woman just laid on the floor, still out cold with her face all swollen on one side. I started wondering how her husband could have found her, and when it hit me, the realization made me feel twice as nauseous. He must have seen that I recognized her when he showed me that photo of her, or maybe he just smelled the lie for what it was. Then all he had to do was follow me back to the motel at a distance, and then he could have watched from afar as I knocked on that door of her room. I made it easy for him. I thought that I'd been helping her, and instead, I condemned her to face a nightmare come to life. The cops arrived to secure the area, and then not long after, the EMTs showed up and wheeled her away on a stretcher. She was awake by then, but she obviously wasn't doing too well, and I couldn't bring myself to try and talk to her because of how guilty I felt. I was convinced that I'd led her abusive husband straight to her, and I'm still convinced that that's the case, even after years upon years of trying to convince myself otherwise. After the cops and EMTs drove off, the whole lot went completely quiet again, and I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. In the morning, I packed my bag and checked out, barely making eye contact with the manager as I did so. I didn't ask about the woman and I couldn't bring myself to. I just sort of got in my car and drove off. I've been cleaning rooms at the Cedar Pines Motel for almost 15 years now. It's not a fancy place, just one of those long, single-story motels you see off the highway, the kind with faded green doors and an ice machine that only seems to work when it wants to. We get a mix of guests. Some are just passing through, some stay for a couple of weeks, and you learn very quickly not to ask too many questions. Now, it was a quiet afternoon in late September, I remember, and I was coming back from cleaning room 8 when I saw a kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, walking back and forth outside room 14. Now, at first, I thought he was just playing, maybe waiting for his parents to come back from the vending machine. But after a while, I noticed that he wasn't playing so much as just sort of pacing up and down. And when I asked him where his mom and dad were, he just sort of shrugged and said he didn't know. I didn't look scared exactly, more like empty. Like whatever had happened had knocked all the pep out of him or something. And after taking the kid's hand, I went to the office to find Carl, the clerk on duty. And Carl's the kind of guy who's been doing this job forever and who doesn't get rattled very easily. I told him about that kid and he checked the logbook. Now, sure enough, room 14 had been rented out the night before to a couple with a child who actually paid cash. Now, the three of us had then tried knocking on the door of room 14. Carl knocked but got no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. He gave me a nervous look, then went to get his master key. And the smell hit me before the door was even halfway open. Not the strong, rotting smell you get when something's been dead a while, more like that metallic tang of fresh blood. The room was a wreck. The bed sheets were tangled and stained, drawers had been pulled out and clothes thrown all over, and one of the lamps were knocked over and cracked. I saw flecks of blood on one of the walls, little spots like someone had flicked a paintbrush dipped in red. There was more on the bed sheets, so much that we couldn't write it off as a nosebleed or something equally harmless. Carl swore under his breath and I stepped back quickly so the kid couldn't see. I put my hands on his shoulders and turned him toward the parking lot, telling him that we were going to wait outside. I tried to keep him talking, asking about school and if he liked cartoons. He barely answered me. It was like he knew what had happened and he couldn't process it yet. The police showed up maybe 20 minutes later. The first 2 deputies went in to search the room, and then not long after, they were joined by another officer in plain clothes who I'm guessing was a detective. And that's when I knew that it must have been something serious, very serious. They kept asking us the same questions over and over, stuff like how we found the kid, what time it was, if we'd seen anyone come or go. And I told them everything we knew, which wasn't much. Carl told them about the cash payment and that there was no car listed on the registry. Now, once I was done with the cops, I kept trying to keep the kid distracted. I found some old crayons in the office desk and a few sheets of paper, and he sat at one of the lobby tables and drew pictures while the cops went in and out of the room. At one point, I remember looking over to see what he was drawing and saw it look like a bed with red scribbles all over it. I don't know if it was my imagination, kind of like filling in the gaps, but I felt horrible knowing that he might have seen something happen to his parents. A few guests came by to see what the commotion was, but the cops kept moving along until one lady, the lady in room 6, said that she thought that she'd heard a loud bang in the middle of the night. It had been loud enough to wake her, but since it only happened the one time, she'd figured it was just someone dropping a heavy suitcase or maybe her hearing something. Only then did she realize that she might well have heard something terrible actually happening. It was maybe 2 hours before a woman from Child Protective Services stopped by to see about the kid. She was polite but firm with us, but super sweet and friendly with the kid as she told him that he needed to go with her to talk to some nice folks over at her office. He didn't ask questions. He just took her hand and followed her to her car. I don't know why, but I knew right then that whatever happened in that room, he wasn't going to see his parents ever again. The police never told us much after that. They took the sheets and the lamp and some clothing and a few other things from the room, and it was sealed for a while, and when I finally got it back to clean, it was completely stripped bare. The mattress was gone, the curtains were gone, almost everything had been taken away to be examined as evidence. They left a faint outline on the carpet where the bed used to be, and even though I scrubbed for hours, I could still see a shadow of that reddish-brown stain on the wall. Every now and then I wonder about that kid, if he remembers that day, if he ever found out what happened. I've cleaned plenty of bad messes in my time, rooms full of garbage, rooms where people overdosed, heck, even rooms where people have died. But there was something different about room 14, something about the quiet way that boy paced outside like he already knew that he was alone. I still work here and not much has changed. The paint on the doors is even more faded and the ice machine still doesn't work half the time, but I can't walk past that room without glancing at the door. I half expect to see a small figure waiting there, pacing back and forth, not knowing, or maybe knowing too well, why Mom and Dad are gone forever. For under 5 years, I used to work the front desk at a little motel in the middle of nowhere. It was a quiet little place, a little run down, but Rhonda, our cleaner, kept the place sparkling. We used to get hunters in the fall, fishermen in the summer, and the occasional trucker rolling in during the midnight hours. And as much as it was mostly a boring job, I came to appreciate the safety and stability. But every so often, we got some real bad men rolling into that old parking lot of ours, and one of them came in the spring of 1996. It was late on a Sunday evening when his car turned into the lot. It had been a quiet day, maybe 4 or 5 check-ins, and I was halfway through a bad cup of coffee when he walked up to the front desk. He looked normal, a regular middle-aged white guy with a big coat and a red woolly hat. He was friendly too and greeted me warmly before saying he wanted a room for the night. I checked which rooms were free, told him the rate, and then after he slid a credit card across the counter, I ran it through, but the machine declined it. And he says, "Huh? That's weird. It's been working fine all day," and then asked me to try the card again. I did, not once, but twice, and both times the card was declined. The guy seemed really embarrassed. He pulled out his wallet as he apologized a bunch, and I told him it was fine as he handed me the cash. Those things happen from time to time, and he didn't have anything to apologize for. He gave me this big smile as he thanked me, and then after I handed him his key and directed him to room 6, he thanked me and headed off down the hall. I was working the night shift that night, 9 p.m. to 7 a.m., so aside from watching the place and making sure the vending machine was all stocked up, all I did was watch movies on the little box TV that we kept in the office. I could keep an eye on the parking lot, so if guests rolled in, I could see them coming. But that night, when I saw headlights coming into the lot, I looked up to see not just one, but two cruisers from the Mason County Sheriff's Department. 2 deputies stayed outside, watching all the rooms, but one deputy came inside to ask me about a declined credit card a few hours earlier. He knew it had been declined 3 times, and he needed to speak to the person using it. When I mentioned the guy in the red hat, the deputy asked which room he was in, and I led him to the room. The door was locked, but I gave them the spare key. They opened it slowly, and their guns were drawn, but the room was empty. The man in the red hat was gone. One of the deputies said that he must have been watching the parking lot, and when he saw the patrol cars drive by, he slipped out through his room's rear window. He left behind nothing but a half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand, a pair of muddy boots by the bed, and the faint smell of something that I couldn't place right away, almost like hair dye or some type of chemical. The deputies asked me to stay out of the room until another group of cops had searched the place and taken away evidence. But then a few hours later, I was taking out some trash when I overheard 2 of the deputies talking to each other, and what I heard made my skin crawl. They said the forensics guy had found a bag in that room and that inside were a whole bunch of different wigs. The forensics team said that they'd need to test it to confirm it, but that at first glance, it looked and felt a hell of a lot like real human hair. But it wasn't that which got me. It was hearing one of the deputies say how one of the wigs matched the hair of a missing woman who disappeared only a week or so earlier. And I decided that I didn't want to hear any more. The deputies and forensics folks stayed for a couple of hours. They took the wigs and the boots and even the water bottle. I heard one of them say that they were going to check it for DNA, and when they left, the motel went quiet again, but it felt like anything but peaceful. Just hours before, someone who may or may not have been a psychopath, trophy-seeking murderer had been standing 3 feet from me. I'd handed him a key, smiled at him, and I even told him to have a good night. And all the while, maybe in that bag that he was carrying, there was some missing woman's hair. That thought will stay with me as long as I live, and you should have seen how calm he was too. You'd never have suspected in a million years that he was capable of something like that. No visible nerves, no rush, just sort of still, like he had all the time in the world. And I didn't hear much beyond that. The sheriff came back a few days later to ask me some more questions, but they hadn't caught the guy, and he couldn't say if the hair really did belong to that missing woman, but I could tell by the way he talked that it was probably bad. After that, every time someone walked through that door to check in, I watched them a little differently. I still think about that man, a whole lot actually, because I know people like him don't just exist in movies or the news now. They walk through the front door with a big old smile on their face, pretending there's someone they're not. And you've got no way of knowing who they really are until it's too late.
Back in 2007, shortly after my 15th birthday, my mom was out of town for a few days on a business trip. We lived alone in a small house in a neighborhood that was on the sketchier end of decent, and that fact, combined with my mother's paranoia about me being home alone longer than 4 or 5 hours, meant that I had to stay over at a friend's house while she was gone. My friend lived across the street and over one house from my own. The place my mom was going to was only about 2 hours away, and I had gotten a bug up my ass about being treated like the young woman that everyone kept calling me. So the week leading up to the trip, I was bitching and moaning about being old enough to take care of myself, and insisting that I could just check in with my friend's parents every now and then. But in truth, my house was pretty creepy at night, even when my mom was there. And I found out the day that my mom was scheduled to leave that my friend had somehow gotten her hands on a PS3, so it didn't take me too long to get over being unfairly babysat. At around 11 on the last night I was there, we ended up back in my friend's room screwing around with a brand new flip phone that I had gotten for my birthday. Her parents had gone out hours earlier, after buying us a pizza for dinner, and probably wouldn't be back for at least another hour. We had gotten bored downstairs with her one PS3 game that we had been playing for days already. It turns out that she had the PlayStation, but didn't have any money to buy multiple games for it. It was too late to call any of our friends, but I knew that my mom would be coming home the following morning at some ungodly hour. And I knew that she had this thing about our answering machine. No matter how tired she was, no matter where she had gotten back from, if there were any messages on the answering machine, she would listen to all of them. Being bored 15-year-olds, my friend and I decided to leave a message or two for my mom to find in the morning. We called my home phone and put it on speaker, cracking up and trying to figure out what our message was going to say. It normally took 5 rings for the call to go to the machine, but on the 3rd ring, someone picks up. "Hello?" The voice sounded like it belonged to some 60-year-old man who had been smoking for at least 40 years of his life. But even past that, there was this malice in his voice. I can't quite describe it exactly, but it sounded very cold and very dangerous. The sort of voice where if you heard it on the street, you would want to stay away from that person. I looked at my friend. Her eyes were huge and her face went completely pale, and I'm sure that mine didn't look any better. Neither of us could get it together and say anything in response. "Hello?" The voice came again, and I tried to speak out something along the lines of, "Who the hell are you, and why are you in my house?" But then the man spoke again, in a very low voice. "You shouldn't have called." There was some sort of slam, and the phone line disconnected. I immediately dropped my phone and proceeded to freak the fuck out, and so did my friend. She asked me if I knew who that was, and I said no. Of course I didn't know the creepy-ass guy answering my phone at 11 o'clock at night. We checked the call log to see if we had accidentally dialed the wrong number. But no, it was the correct number. We were so shaken up that we couldn't immediately figure out who we should call or what to do. Should we call the cops or my mom, or run around the house to make sure that all the doors and windows were locked? We ended up multitasking, sprinting around my friend's house, double-checking every lock we could, while gasping into the phone at my friend's parents about what was going on. They were about 15 minutes away and said that they would call the police. Her mother told us to stay in the house with all the doors locked and all the lights on, just in case the intruder was going from house to house. And so for the next 10 minutes, we were huddled in the far corner of my friend's room, basically under her bed, jumping every time the house settled. You can imagine how freaked out we were when her parents came rushing in and started rattling at her bedroom door. Forgetting that it was locked on their orders. The cops got to my house not long after her parents arrived home, and to be honest, I don't really remember a lot of the specifics about what the cops were doing, mainly because I refused to set foot outside of my friend's house. But I remember that they asked my friend and I a lot of questions, and we really couldn't give them a whole lot of information. Unfortunately, we called from my friend's room, which was located in the back of her house, was away from where we would have been able to see my house. And some dude with a creepy smoker voice isn't a very helpful description to go off of when you're looking for someone. One question that stuck out to me though, because I remember thinking of how weird it was for them to ask this, was who had the keys to my house. I told them that only my mother and I had the keys. I found out later that the reason they asked was because there were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, and the front door was wide open when they got there. There appeared to be nothing missing, but our wall-mounted corded phone was hanging off its hook. and the phone base itself was cracked, like someone had slammed the phone down on the receiver too hard. Both my mom's room and my room also had stuff moved around and displaced. Someone had gone through our drawers. They got a hold of my mom at some point during all this, and she managed to get home that night, very tired and very freaked out about what happened. The cops investigated the incident, but never came up with any answers. We weren't doing too well financially at this point, but we still managed to move across town within a few months of this happening. For the months between that night and the day we moved, while I barely got any sleep and had these awful nightmares, I also flat out refused to be alone in the house, even for a couple of minutes, and I began to get very obsessive about checking and double-checking all the locks, a habit which has stuck around since this happened. Now that I've been writing this all out, I remember that there was one thing that I haven't told anyone, mostly because at the time, I thought the whole thing might have been blamed on me if I had said anything. Earlier in the day of the incident, I had gone back over to my house to get a notebook that was full of writing I wanted to show my friend. Nothing was obviously wrong as far as I could tell. The front door was locked when I got there, and there were no signs of any tampering, no noises from any part of the house. But the minute I stepped inside, I felt that something was just off. Really off. It was almost too quiet, if that makes sense. I was getting chills up and down my spine, and goosebumps all over. I tried to will myself just to get over it, and go to my room and grab my notebook, but I couldn't make myself take more than a few steps into the house. I was too creeped out. I locked the door and ran back across the street. I've thought back on that moment a lot, wondering if maybe I accidentally left the door open when I left, but there was no way. I distinctly remember turning the deadbolt back in place. When I returned to my friend's house, I felt like an idiot for being such a wimp that I couldn't walk through my own house, even when it was empty. But looking back now, well, who knows? Perhaps my gut feeling is what saved me that day. It freaks me out thinking what would have happened to me if I had gone any further into the house. This situation started back in 2008 during my senior year of high school. I woke up late one night to my phone ringing. I looked at my clock and wondered who could be calling me at 4 o'clock in the morning. The caller ID said it was a private number. Thinking that this was just some automated call, I didn't answer and went back to sleep. Whoever it was didn't leave a voicemail, so I didn't think much of it. Until these calls started to become more frequent. Fast forward to my freshman year of college. These calls started happening almost every night, always around 4 a.m. I never answered them, just because answering an unknown caller has always creeped me out. It definitely wasn't an automated caller either. It was deliberate. I remember being called 3 or 4 more times after not answering the first time. At this point, I was starting to get a little pissed off, because I'm a student who has classes at 8 a.m., and whoever this was needed to stop disrupting my sleep and leave me alone. So one night, when the calls came, I finally answered. "Hello? Who is this?" No response. "Please stop calling me. I think you have the wrong number." I then heard menacing laughter. Followed by incoherent rambling. Even though I couldn't understand what was being said, it sounded threatening. It gives me the chills just thinking back on it. "Look, whoever you are, you have the wrong number. Please stop calling me." I then hung up. I'm thinking this guy is probably just some drunk, because I couldn't understand a word he said. It was just the way he said it really got to me. I got a gut feeling that this guy was someone I never wanted to meet in person. Ever. And that's when I began to wonder if I had a stalker on my hands. I really became paranoid about it. The calls continued for months. They were so frequent that I ended up turning off my phone at night so I could sleep. I never thought about calling the police because I didn't have a number to go by. I was always very aware of my surroundings from that point on, though. Being in a third-floor apartment helped, but still, this entire situation was getting to me. During Christmas break of that year, I went home to Memphis, Tennessee. It was nice to take a break from school and just relax for a change. But early one morning, I get a call from the private number again, except this time, it wasn't 4 a.m., it was around 8 or 9. I answer, and I'm ready to go off on this guy. "Who the hell is this? Leave me alone." I then heard a deep male voice respond, "Are you going to meet me?" This was the only coherent thing I had ever heard from this caller. So in shock, I respond, No, I don't know you," in the most chilling voice I had ever heard. He said, "I know where you live. I'll be there soon." This is the part where I completely flip out. I'm in full-out panic mode. I rush to my parents' room and wake them up. I'm on the verge of tears and I tell them what happened. Obviously, they were very concerned and shared my theory about me having a stalker, and I'm wondering how this guy could possibly know me. Should I call the police? And if so, what do I tell them? My father was in the military, so he's up immediately, grabs a gun from under his bed, and starts keeping an eye out for mysterious cars driving around outside. I was too petrified to get any more sleep that night. Sorry if this seems anticlimactic, but thankfully, nothing else happened after that day. I decided that if I got another call from him, I would go to my phone company and see if they could trace his number and report him to the police, but the calls just stopped altogether, and I haven't gotten another one since. I've always wondered if it was someone messing with me, but from the way he said, "I know where you live. I'll be there soon," it didn't sound like he was messing around. It sounded threatening. I can't help but wonder if he thought he was calling someone else, someone that he knew, and he was going to go over to that person's house and do something terrible to them. I really hope it wasn't some other girl who just happened to sound like me. If it was, I really hope she's okay. But the way the calls just stopped completely makes me think otherwise. For some background information, I'm a female, and about 2 years ago, I had to go to a psychiatric facility so I could deal with some depression issues. At the time, I was 14. I had been in the hospital for 3 days when this all started. One morning, I woke up with an awful stomach ache and convinced the nurses to let me stay in from the activities and sleep off the pain. So while I'm alone in the hospital, my room phone begins ringing. I run over to it and answer it, thinking it could be my boyfriend or my parents calling. But instead it's a man's voice I didn't recognize. "Can I talk to Sandra?" "Sorry, there's no Sandra here." "Oh, alright, thanks. Who is this?" The voice sounded a lot like my friend's dad, who I had just met the night before during visiting hours. I told him my name, figuring he would recognize it. "So what are you in there for?" That's personal." This conversation was starting to raise red flags for me, because I had told my friend's dad why I was there the night before. "Did you fight to get in there? Beating up other girls?" I said no, and I was quickly becoming creeped out. It took me a minute, but I realized that there was no Sandra at this hospital. I wasn't really sure on everyone's names, but I'm pretty sure there was no Sandra there. Now I was starting to get very uncomfortable, and I told him that I had to go, and that was it. Visiting hours came around, and another phone call comes in for me. It was a man asking for me by name, claiming to be my father. But here's the thing, my dad was sitting right next to me. I explained that the caller had contacted me earlier, and my dad was pissed. He went over to the phone and demanded to know who was calling. The man didn't say anything and hung up. After a couple more calls came in asking for me by name, I informed the hospital staff, and they became very concerned and discontinued phone calls altogether. Apparently, a convicted rapist had been calling the mental hospital for years, getting names of the girls who answer the phone. He then uses whatever information he learns from the girls and then calls back posing as their father or boyfriend. Apparently, he had even tried to pick up patients a couple of times. The weirdest part is, when you call the hospital, you have to know the birthday of the patient, or the staff won't put the call through. So he somehow knew a bunch of information about the patients there, and used it to prey on us. It definitely freaked me out at the time, seeing as he's the one who should have been in the hospital. Oh, and one last thing. The guy is definitely not my friend's dad. He just happened to have a similar voice, I guess. It was late when I stumbled into my apartment last night, trying to be as quiet as I could, but managing to bang into damn near everything, cringing at each thing I knocked over. I groped my way through the dark into my bedroom. It must have been 2, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning. The bar was closed, that's for sure. I stripped down to my boxers and tried to crawl into bed as quietly as I could. My girlfriend would definitely be pissed off at me arriving home at this ungodly hour. But thankfully, she didn't stir. I slunk down into the pillow, eyes dreary, breath heavy. I was nearly asleep, spinning away into a dream when my phone began vibrating. I let out a groan before rolling over to the side of the bed and reaching for my phone. But when I looked at the screen, I was confused. It was my girlfriend's number. She must have left it at a friend's house and they were calling my phone to let me know. So I answered it. Hello?
Hey babe, I just got home. Could you help me bring in the laundry?
What the? It was my girlfriend's voice, but I turned my head to the huddled body lying next to me. My mind ran through infinite scenarios of what unimaginable horror awaited me underneath those sheets. It is a very cold and unnerving feeling when you find out that the person lying next to you in bed was not who you thought they were. With my stomach in my throat and my eyes wide with terror, I grabbed a handful of blanket and snatched it away. My girlfriend moaned into consciousness and stared at me, confused. I shined my phone's light in her face to make sure she wasn't some sunken-eyed specter. But no, she just looked really pissed off when she saw my eyes wide and my mouth open. I bet I looked pretty stupid.
You stupid drunken asshole, go to sleep.
She seethed and smacked me with a pillow. She then kicked my side a few times, grumbled some obscenities, and flipped over toward the wall. Yep, that's definitely her. I must have hung up the phone during the commotion, because it began vibrating again. I jumped a bit, my nerves still a bit frayed. It was her number again. I answered.
Hey babe, I just got home. Could you help me bring in the...
I hung up right away. It sounded exactly like her, but she was lying in bed right next to me. Her basket of folded clean clothes was in the corner of the room. I remember her bringing it home earlier, and I reluctantly dragged it all up the stairs for her. I crawled over to the window and with 2 fingers separated the blinds so I could peer through. I scanned the lot for her car, and I saw it directly below our bedroom. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. They looked nearly identical to her. The longer I stared, the more it sank in that there was something very, very off here. I then began to notice slight differences. Her neck seemed too long, her shoulders much too narrow, and her head was too thin. It was like once it realized its disguise failed, that it began to show its true form. Her face began to twist to the side, all the while a toothy grin stretched wider and wider until it was touching both ears. Her large eyes had turned black and were staring straight forward into the steering wheel. Suddenly, her face snapped upwards. Her black eyes were now staring into my window. She raised a misshaped hand to her head, and my phone began to vibrate once more. I had been staring in shock and complete disbelief at what I was seeing. The light buzzing in my hand jolted me back to reality. All the air left my lungs, and I collapsed next to my girlfriend, which caused her to wake up again. Still in a tired stupor, I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her over to the window. Look inside your car," I whispered, nearly in tears. She looked around for her car, and then she saw it.
What the?
She began to speak, looking very worried. Her expression changed into a twisted grimace of pure terror. She suddenly began shrieking and sobbing hysterically. She shoved her head into my side, my arms pulling her close to my abdomen. We were like a couple of frightened children. I was unable to look away from the window. I watched as the thing inside her car opened the door, and power walked away with unnatural speed. It headed toward the forested lake to the left of the apartments. However, it kept its head toward us the whole time, its neck bending gruesomely backwards as the rest of its body strutted away. It wasn't grinning anymore. It was frowning, almost like it was sad. We must have tired ourselves out from all those surges of adrenaline, because right after it vanished into the dark, I remember waking up in the daylight. My girlfriend was still tangled in my arms. Both of us slumped on each other. I checked my phone to see what time it was, and saw that I had 16 missed calls, all between the times of 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. We hadn't tried calling each other since yesterday afternoon. I still have no idea how her phone had been used like that. It was plugged in next to her the whole night, and there weren't any outgoing calls from her phone to mine. What's even stranger, though, is that when she checked her phone, she had 18 missed calls, but from my number. Each one, same as mine, was made between the time of 1 and 7 a.m. I didn't really know what to say to her, so I blurted out, "Well, I guess that means no more late-night taco runs for a while." Neither of us laughed.
It was a rainy night, and I had just finished my shift at a local family diner. It was the so-called hotspot of my town where everyone from around would often stop by for a coffee or a bite to eat. This happened in the late fall of New Jersey. I was in high school at the time and worked this job to save up for a car. We'll call the diner the Shack. The Shack was about a 40-minute drive from my apartment where I lived with my mom. I obviously didn't own a car, so that meant I would be constantly taking the bus to and from work. Well, on this night, I was getting ready to close so I could make it to the bus when a coworker of mine had accidentally dropped some dishes on the floor. Being the kind-hearted soul I was, I offered to help her clean up, which maybe took about a few minutes max. After that, we clocked out and I walked over to the bus stop. But after checking the bus tracker on my phone, I came to the realization that I was 10 minutes too late. That was the last bus transit in the area, so that meant I had no way of getting home. This was before Uber and Lyft were a thing, and I didn't have the number for my coworkers, so I couldn't ask for help. And my mother was the type of person who made me take accountability for my mistakes. So if I were to ask her to come get me, she'd decline and scold me about how I should have planned accordingly. At that point, I decided that I'd walk home, which would take a little over 2 hours. Now, the diner I worked at was located in the suburbs of town. There's a single road with woods on both sides of it, and the diner was sort of alongside the road. The nearest buildings were quite a ways away, so the location was sort of rural, if that makes sense. So there I am, walking along the sidewalk with my earbuds in, listening to my music for about 20 minutes when my iPod died. Because I'm the idiot who constantly forgets to charge it and leaves her cable at home. With nothing to do, I get out my phone and played some iOS games while watching ahead of me. Then, about 3 minutes later, I see lights slowly illuminate from behind me and the sound of an engine. I turn around and there's a car approaching and stops right next to me. The driver puts their window down and I see a man I had never seen before ask if I were okay. I told him that I was and that I was just walking home. He acknowledges me and asks, "I can give you a ride if you want. I'm going in that direction anyway, so it won't be a problem." Now let me give you a description on this dude. He appeared to be around my age, decent looking, and wore a Target uniform. I know this because my sister used to work at Target and would always come home wearing the same uniform. I was hesitant at first, but it was damn near freezing out and getting a ride seemed like the only option. At that point, I accepted the ride and got into the front seat of his car. I know, I'm an idiot. He introduced himself as David and told me he was actually heading home himself. I sort of grew on him and told him my situation about missing the bus and how nobody would come to get me. He then starts to make this joke about how he was lucky he found me, which I'll admit made me a little uncomfortable. Although I didn't tell him that as I didn't want to sound rude. I give him the basic directions of the area my apartment was in, and he starts heading towards there. Not much was said for most of the car ride though. Every time I'd start up a conversation with him, he'd give me a dry response or short replies. I figured he wasn't the social type, so I just sort of sat back and ended up falling asleep. As I said, it was a 40-minute drive, and I was exhausted from work. I wake up about maybe 20 minutes later and look out the window to see that we were in a completely different area. We were on this paved dirt road in the woods that I could only assume was maybe in the area of my work.
David? We're going the wrong way.
Yeah, I know. I just have to do something really quick. Right then, I took notice that his demeanor completely shifted, which made my heart race. He went from this casual, normal guy to just sketchy. Just then, another car approaches us nose to nose and I see two people get out. He tells me to wait inside the car while he, quote, deals with this and to not get out. I see two men along with David go up to each other and begin talking while occasionally glancing over at me. For whatever reason, I started to get this strange feeling that something was off. Something in my gut told me I wasn't safe and that I needed to get out of there ASAP. I undo my seatbelt and open the door slightly when I hear this blood-curdling scream that echoed across the area. The scream surely came from inside that other car, and that's when I booked it out of there. I hear one of the men yell, "Hey," followed by 2 gunshots that thankfully missed me. As horrified as I was, I didn't care anymore. I only focused on what was in front of me, praying to God I didn't trip. All the while, I could hear footsteps approaching fast from behind while I'm navigating through the woods. Eventually, I come across a highway with some truck haulers passing through and flag them down. Thankfully, one of them stops, and after explaining myself, he takes me to the nearest police station. From there, I called my mom, frantically telling her to please pick me up. She of course did, and apologized profusely for not picking me up to begin with. I cried for hours on and quit my job the next day. The police had looked into what had happened and had managed to find the dirt road, but no signs of the cars. They also contacted all the targets in the area, asking if anyone named David worked there. Sure enough, there was no record of any David working there. This meant that whoever's car I got into that night was posing as a fake Target employee as a way to, I guess, make themselves trustworthy. As for the scream I heard, that was never revealed. I'm convinced that whatever I came across that night was some sort of trafficking ring, and that I was their next victim. Lots of crime and shady stuff happen around the area I live in, but I just haven't seen it until now. A year later, I moved out of state for college, and I'm having the time of my life in a much safer environment. This happened in 2008 when I was around 13, and at the time we lived in Florida. Life was kind of like what you'd expect for Florida. It rained a lot and was almost tropical during the summers. It was just me and my sister, and we were living with my dad and my now stepmom. Long story short, both my parents are split, with my mom living in another state, so my dad had obtained full custody of me and my sister. Sometimes my dad would have to go into work really late at his job and wouldn't come back until the next morning. One night, my dad had gotten ready for work and a thunderstorm was rolling through. We're pretty used to them coming, as after all, it was the start of hurricane season in the middle of summer. My now stepmom, younger sister, and I were in the couch in the living room watching the hit series of The Big Bang Theory. Us kids never really understood the show, but we found ourselves enjoying it for whatever reason. We're about halfway through an episode when the power immediately goes out. Nothing too weird. This was common in storms, and the power was a piece of shit, so this was no surprise. My stepmom got the flashlights and lanterns to have at least some form of light with us until the power came back. My dad says that he was going to go outside to check the power box and see if he could fix it before he left. My stepmom sort of watched over us as we waited for my dad. Then, after 10 minutes or so, my dad comes back in soaking wet. He comes back in with this sheer look of pure panic and puts his finger over his lips and tells us that he wasn't going to go into work tonight. My stepmom gives him a "what the hell is wrong" type of gesture, and he brings her aside. I wasn't sure what he told her at first, but whatever it was enough to make her visibly shaken up. She grabs us kids and takes us upstairs to her room while I see my dad getting out his 9mm. I remember asking my stepmom what my dad was doing, but she tried avoiding my question at all costs. My dad was gone for a few minutes while my stepmom was on the phone with someone. All the while, I stayed with my sister and read her a story from her book. Then, a few minutes later, my dad comes back and tells us kids something shocking. He said as he was outside checking the power box, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The minute he opened up the box, he saw that it had been cut. At first, I really didn't understand, but then it hit me. The box had been cut, broken, tampered with. At that point, I put two and two together and understood that someone had done this. Someone with obviously very bad intentions. Turns out, the person my mom was talking to was the police, who were now sending out units. Now, this next part is what drives my family insane. Maybe about 2 minutes later, the home phone in my parents' room rings and my dad picks up. After saying hello a few times, he hears a man with a raspy voice saying that he was in our house, and that he would kill him and my stepmom as well as us kids, followed by this menacing laugh that could be heard through the phone. There are other things he said he would do to our family that I cannot say, but it involves slitting our throats. My dad hangs up the phone and locks the door while we waited for the police. The sound of police sirens was music to our ears, and that's when my dad runs downstairs screaming like a madman, telling whoever was in our house that he was going to be the one to die and that he dared him to attack him. However, the person was nowhere to be found. My dad opened the door for the police while they proceeded to conduct their investigation. They searched around our house, but as far as I knew then, nothing ever became of it. My dad made us stay with our grandparents for a few days until they were absolutely sure nothing else was out of the ordinary. I sort of just went with life after that and forgot about the whole thing for quite some time. That was until one day, about 6 or 7 years later, where it was brought up in conversation. My dad remembers it very vividly and finally told my sister and I something we didn't know. That night, when police were investigating our house, they had found muddy shoe prints walking toward my bedroom door. This man had been in our house for God knows how long, and we didn't even notice. My dad thought he was just bluffing over the phone, but never thought he was actually serious about being in our house. Sometimes, though, I still wonder a horrifying thought. Had my stepmom sent us to our own rooms, would he have quietly came into my room and slit my throat? That is what scares me the most, and it's also the reason why I always carry. In the early 2000s, when I was around 19 or so, my friends and I attended a rock concert of our favorite band, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I lived in Arizona at the time, and there's not much to do, so this was our highlight of the year. We've been wanting to see this performance for months now, and they had fortunately been on tour in our city. Needless to say, we had a great time, and once the concert was over, everyone had to exit the venue. We exit the venue, and I call my mom to pick us up, as she would be the one to take us back. However, she told me that her car was having trouble starting, and that my sister had taken the other car elsewhere. Other than that, my mom sort of left it up to us to decide how to get home. Now, for a little bit of context, the three of us were a bit rebellious and did things most parents probably wouldn't agree on. One of my friends recommended we hitchhike, as he claimed he's done it many times before and that it always works. I've never hitchhiked before, so naturally I was skeptical about it. But my other friends sort of talked me into it, and in the end, I had to agree. We walk along the sidewalk and stick out our thumbs to indicate that we needed a ride. After maybe about 20 or so cars that passed, we see one car slowly pull up to us. The driver were these two Hispanic men who were maybe in their 30s hitting vapes. We thought nothing of it, and they agreed to give us a ride back so long as we paid them a few bucks. I'd say right away, however, I began to get this strange vibe from them that seemed relatively off. For some reason though, I just couldn't put my finger on it. They start making their way over to my house, with us helping direct them on where to go. Then, after 10 minutes or so, the driver tells us that he has to pick something up from a friend which happened to be on the way to my house. I mean, I guess there wasn't an issue, so I told him it was fine. He gives me a nod as a thank you, and we go on our way. So there we are, all in the car, not saying a word to each other, when they pull into this empty plaza where another car can be seen. And standing outside of this car were a few people. At first, we didn't think much of it, but as we got closer, I began to notice how intimidating these people were. There were 3 men, 2 of them being absolute units and 1 with a black mask. Alarms instantly go off in my head, and we all kind of look at each other knowing damn well this wasn't right. The driver and his buddy get out of the car, leaving one of the windows open so we were able to understand a lot what was said. Apparently, this guy had owed money to these people for the import of various goods. At first, we didn't understand what he meant by that, but after putting 2 and 2 together, we realized it had to be drugs. Because our driver is in trouble with the fucking cartel. My friends and I are debating on what to do now, as we know damn well from movies and TV shows that these people do not mess around, especially when they're owed money. Suddenly, I hear one of the men speaking Spanish and watch as he pulls out a gun and puts it to our driver's head. All the while, the driver is begging for his life and promises to pay them soon. My stepmother is Mexican, so while I understand a fair bit of Spanish, I don't speak it. What they're saying to this man, though, is horrendous. For one, they knew where our driver lived, knew his family, and that if he didn't pay up by a certain time, they'd kill both him, his wife, and their 6-month-old child. More specifically, to keep his child for themselves. Whatever that meant. There was other stuff that was said that I'm not going to share, but you get the idea. My friends and I were appalled by what we were hearing, and just then, 2 of the cartel members spot my friends in the car. These car windows weren't tinted by any means, and the parking lot lights made it easy for us to be seen. They approached the car while one of the men stayed with our driver. I quietly cussed to myself, and once they approached the car, they motioned for us to roll down the window. We were hesitant at first, but eventually complied and rolled it down. One of the men spoke with this heavy accent and told us that our friend over here was in, quote, deep trouble. Then they told us something that absolutely shook us to the bone.
Do you see your friend there? ¿Tú crees que nos olvidamos? We never forget about it. You either nos debes or we come for your family first. That's how we teach you loyalty.
I shit you not, I almost threw up right then and there, but somehow managed to keep my composure. A few minutes later, the driver gets back in the car, sweating like a dog, and tells us that everything is fine and to not worry. Me, nor my friends ever found the words to say. We just stayed quiet for the rest of the ride. Needless to say, they did drop us off while telling us to not say a word about what had happened. When we got home, my parents could tell we were a bit shaken up, but we had just said that we were tired after a long night out. I'm still not sure what they would have done had we told them the real reason. For the next 2 or so weeks, we all laid out our theories about why or how this guy may have been involved with the cartel. We weren't sure if it was by choice, forced into it, or was perhaps even part of it. How they knew his family and where they were is anyone's guess. They could have been bluffing, but if it's anything like the movies or shows, everyone knows that these people will find you some way, somehow. The one thing we do know is that I myself am highly convinced that we got into a car with a cartel member that night. My friends and I are thankful to be alive today, because they could have easily killed us right there as a way of demonstrating to our driver their raw power. We certainly don't plan on seeing those people again, never mind hitchhiking again. This happened to my dad when he was in his 20s, and it's something even he still can't get over. Not because of what he saw, but because of what happened, as it still bothers him till this day. This happened in the 80s. My dad had just finished dropping off his group of friends at their university dorms in his new Mustang. As a young adult, he loved that car and essentially treated it as his own kid. Sounds weird, I know, but that's what happens when you have a dad who is obsessed with automobiles. My dad had lived off campus at his parents' house, aka my grandparents', and was driving home after a night out. He described this night as being tiring and, quote, very dark. He's driving along, navigating on this dark stretch of road when he sees something up ahead. Upon closer inspection, he saw that it was a young woman, maybe late 20s to early 30s, flagging him down, giving the all too familiar upward thumb. Now, my dad was and is a nice guy, especially to someone who needed help. Without question, he opens the passenger door and she gets in without saying a word and points in the direction she wants to go. My dad had assumed she was deaf or had a speech issue that would prevent her from speaking. But needless to say, he was too tired to care and just drove off. She doesn't say a word, and my dad is just focused on the road ahead of him, not paying attention to the woman. At some point, he begins to get tired and glances over to the passenger seat to see that the woman is now gone. This obviously catches him off guard, and he slams the brakes while absolutely losing his shit. After stopping his car and looking back down the road, he tries to process what just happened. After a while, he just keeps driving with his heart pounding out of his chest and ends up at a small gas station nearby. My dad goes in and explains to the gas station attendant about the woman who just blatantly disappeared from his car. According to my dad, he thought the attendant would think of him as crazy, but his true reaction was something he'd never expected. The attendant calmly said to him, I'm not surprised. You're not the first person to tell me that."
I recently acquired a new roommate. The entire situation should have never happened, but I needed someone to help with the rent. So a Craigslist posting later, he moved in. His name was Greg, and he disclosed to me that he did have some strange sleeping behaviors. Sleep talking, sleepwalking, and night terrors. Funny thing was that I had a history of sleepwalking myself, but only on rare occasions. The first incident occurred about 1 week later when I had heard him screaming in the middle of the night. Since we both sleep in separate rooms on different sides of the house, the scream sounded distant, but enough to scare me so much that I ran to check on him. As I got closer to his bedroom, he stopped screaming, so I just went back to bed. For the next month, he had no issues. I noticed that he had no friends or family that would visit, and I never saw or heard him on the phone or texting. Then another random night, Greg started screaming. The same thing. I got up and started to go to his room, but he'd stop. Then one night I was awoken by screaming in my bedroom. I couldn't see anything in the panic, so I turned on the bedside lamp, and he was at the foot of my bed wearing some sleeping clothes, athletic shorts and a t-shirt. Scared me, so I started screaming and woke him up. He apologized and went back to bed. Then the scariest thing happened. About 2 nights later, I awoke to clinking. Sounded like tools and hammers tapping. I turned on the light to see Greg kneeling down in a corner working on something with his hands. A few seconds after turning the light on, Greg froze, then slowly turned his upper body around and stared blankly at me while I laid in bed. I was beyond creeped out, so I slowly slid out of bed and left the house. After sleeping in my truck down the road in an empty church parking lot, I returned to the house at about 8 in the morning. Greg was gone. All of his belongings were gone. No signs of him anywhere. It was like he never lived there. I don't know any of his friends or family, so I had no one to call about him. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. When I moved out after the lease was up, I was moving my furniture out of my bedroom. In the corner of the room where I last saw Greg kneeling down, I realized the floor vent for the air conditioning was loose. Inside the floor vent was an envelope with a ton of pictures of me sleeping. The pictures had handwritten dates and times written on the back of the pictures. The only other item was a whittled down wooden broom handle brought to a point. I truly believe Greg was preparing to kill me that night, and he realized it. Because it was the sleepwalking Greg that was going to do it, he left to save my life. It appears Greg had been coming to my room almost nightly, and he was working on making the broom handle a stabbing weapon, and I had never heard. Not until the last night I saw him. Before any judgment is placed, I would like to say that I wasn't in the best state of mind prior nor during the situation. I just went through a particularly difficult breakup, a suicide attempt, moved back in with a parent, and then experienced a sexual assault by a trusted friend. I didn't have a good judge of character, and I was by far hitting my rock bottom. After several months in my mother's home and after the sexual assault, I realized I desperately needed to get out of that atmosphere and try to get back up on my feet. I found a cheap home for rent and began my life all over again. It wasn't the nicest place, certainly not as warm and comforting as my last place, but it would do temporarily. Shortly after moving in, still not in the right mindset, and with a huge lack of self-care, I began using almost anything I could get my hands on. Many psychedelics, acid, mushrooms, and MDMA. Anyone who has experienced MDMA can tell you it gives you this incredible sense of happiness and content, which at the time I had neither. These short-term bouts of false happiness sucked any remaining serotonin from my brain, and it left me feeling just, if not more, empty inside. On top of that, after my suicide attempt, I was abruptly taken off all of my medications, as I used them to hurt myself prior. This meant my sleeping medication, and with it trickled down that familiar insomnia. Then my SSRI, which when stopping abruptly can exceedingly send you into a state of manic depression and confusion. And last but not least, my anxiety medication. I relied on this for years. It took me out of my agoraphobia, and it helped me with my PTSD triggers, which having my attacker live just several blocks away on the same very street as another individual who abused me from ages 11 to 14, I simply lost all abilities to cope. After some time of intense withdrawals from my anxiety medication, and even experiencing a seizure, I began to buy pills. The only ones available to me were Xanax, which I quickly developed a tolerance to, and at my worst was taking anywhere from 12 to 20 milligrams a day. Because of the Xanax abuse, there were many things that I didn't completely recall, such as my wedding. It was to a bass-playing musician that I had only known for a month, as well as of the month we spent together. My most vivid memories were lying on the couch watching The Office on Netflix religiously, shaking and sweating in between buys and re-ups from my pill dealer. I began drinking heavily and hanging out in the wrong crowd as well, the grunge/punk crowd. The ones that couch surfed much of their lives, destroyed things in their path, didn't work, and commonly used others, burning each individual bridge as they passed. As I was in no state to actually care, I enjoyed their company. And one in particular I'll refer to as Sideshow Bob started to become what I thought was my best friend, even wearing a dress at my wedding as my maid of honor. He often wore women's clothes. Not because he was transgender, but because he simply liked to. Some made fun of him for this, but I thought it was cool that he didn't care what others thought. He really seemed to have a kind and goofy nature about him. That I admired, but as a man that wore women's clothes, he'd often get into my closet. I'd like to add that Bob also had very poor hygiene. He wore no deodorant, he showered rarely, and his feet. Those feet left a smell that permanently absorbed into the carpet fibers that stayed, even when I moved out. He would often hop off the couch around 4 p.m. or so and rush to his pizza delivery job. He never stopped to shower or even brush his teeth. He'd even wake up and throw back on the same uniform that he'd been wearing for weeks, which stunk of cheap weed, pizza grease, and feet. On New Year's Eve 2016, I left my at the time husband. After a serious withdrawal and being around him completely sober, it became obvious he was using meth. I was suspicious of it before, as I used it too when I was much younger, along with nearly half of my family members. You can always sense it. He knew before marrying me that this was the big no for me. My brother in prison, my father's heart attack and death all contributed to meth use. He knew this when he married me, yet kept it a secret. I do blame myself partly for this. It's the kind of thing that occurs when you marry a stranger. About a year later, he had passed away from a shot laced with fentanyl. They found his body 5 days later. After the separation from my husband, I had allowed Bob to stay. He didn't have a room. He slept on the couch. He didn't contribute to groceries or bills, and quite frankly turned my home into a disgusting mess. But since my OCD seemed to have dissolved into my drinking, and I preferred not being alone with my thoughts, I didn't really mind. Within a week of leaving my husband, Bob grew increasingly more obsessed with the thought of us being together. I made it very clear I had no intentions with him and I valued our friendship. Not to mention, I was about to experience my first divorce and all the shame that came along with it. I started avoiding the home. I started avoiding him. Every time I'd return home, he'd be there, in tears. Some days I'd find him not only in my clothes, but in my bed. Eventually, he quit his job to have a better chance of seeing me. He'd follow me room to room, demanding to know why it is that I can't see us together. Eventually, I told him if it didn't stop, he needed to leave. But he was quick to throw back into my face that legally he was a tenant in my home and that he needed 30 days notice.
I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me,
he told me. Things grew much more aggressive, and I grew more uncomfortable and afraid by the days. His tears turned to anger. His questions turned to screaming. One very vivid memory I have is him staring me directly in the eyes, red-faced, spit flying, screaming,
"You know, I am just so sick of being rejected by women."
He was no longer my goofy drinking buddy. He was someone that I absolutely could not be around. A police officer suggested that I get a restraining order to get him off the premises, which I did. Then I kept the doors locked. His only few possessions in my home were a guitar and an amp, which I had placed on the back porch that notified him. He immediately tried to break into the home, kicking the old front door with such force I could see it begin to crack at the deadbolt, leaving dark shoe prints on the cracked white paint. The police had trouble serving him. He quit his job. He had no actual address, although I had provided them with his car description, license plate, and his friends' addresses. Morning, noon, and night, I'd find myself crying pressed up against that door, hoping that it wouldn't break open. Every time I called the police, he had already left. I'd find myself up at night staring out the windows, watching that loud green car of his drive by, feeling my pulse rise, phone in hand. For weeks, I received surprise visits from him. Most were terrifying. Occasionally, some were thought out. One evening, he had a mutual friend knock on the door, which I happily opened, only for him to quickly jump out from behind the door and attempt entering. I moved as swiftly and strongly as I could to slam the door and lock it, kicking again, calling 911 again. He'd leave again. After a few months, he moved on. He found a girlfriend who'd kicked him out quite quickly. He responded by beating her unconscious and attempting to cut her throat. Luckily, a neighbor heard the commotion and Bob quickly ran. He got off easy on those charges. But of course, if you Google his name, you see the repeated charges of serious assault. I spoke with his exes. I saw the photos of what he had done to their faces, their bodies. All I can think about is how that could have been me. The last time I saw him was back in my hometown at the local grocery store, as I had waited for a cup of coffee after a tiring 10-hour shift at my job. He nodded with a kind smile. I froze, heart throbbing, hand shaking. It was that day that I moved an hour and a half away. It's this month that I'll be moving back. Names have been changed to protect the deceased, and for anonymity as well. After high school many years ago, I was in a bad place. My guardian had kicked me out after graduation. She didn't help me find a place to stay, so I lived in my car for a couple of months. I met some heavy metal dudes at work one day. I'd seen them around town and all of my other friends knew who they were. Everyone loved them. We became friends over a couple of months, and they offered for me to move in with them. I agreed. Looking back on it now, I wish I had just stayed in my car. My two main roommates were brothers named Jack and Cody. They were in a band. They also believed in the occult and anything of that sort. I never really believed in that stuff, but I'm not one to tell someone what they should believe. They had me live with them rent-free for several months, so who was I to complain? Being the only female in a house full of young men, I was always looking over my shoulder. You never know who you can trust. Turns out I was right to worry. Over time, their friends had started to stay with us for longer periods of time, sometimes weeks. Their friends were another group of brothers that they had gone to school with. There were 5 brothers in total, but only 2 stayed with us consistently. The younger brother Sam was very polite. He cleaned up after himself and he always helped with the household chores. The other brother Kevin had a laundry list of mental problems. He had apparently done some bad drugs back in the day, and it had developed into what seemed like psychosis of the religious sort. He had done time in prison for assaulting a woman with the Bible. He would often look you in the eyes and tell you he could see how you would die. Once he told me that I was possessed by a demon and that I needed my soul to be cleansed. Everyone in the house knew that he had these problems, but he was their friend. They had helped him through the hard times and gave him a place to stay. Otherwise, he would be on the streets. I was always on guard around him after the things he told me. No one else seemed to be as concerned as I was. They really should have been. One day I was sleeping and my phone rang. It was my boss. He asked if I could come into work an hour early. It was only 12 p.m. I was broke and, well, I had nothing better to do, so I said yes. I got up and began getting ready to leave. I walked out into the living room to see Sam and Jack sitting on the couch, while Kevin sat on the floor by the TV. He was watching scripture videos on YouTube, some real end-of-the-day stuff. That was fairly common, so I went about my business. I just said goodbye and left for work. My shift at work was almost complete when the phone rang. My boss answered, handed the phone to me, and said, "For you." I was just a cashier, so I assumed it was a friend that couldn't reach me on my phone. I answered the phone and I had heard a man's voice that I didn't recognize.
Hi, this is Detective Nelson. Something happened in your apartment today, and we need you to come to the station to talk about it.
I left for work immediately. I had assumed one of the brothers had been arrested for drug dealing or something. I was very wrong. I got to the station and was buzzed in. An officer escorted me to a small cold room with a camera. He gave me a bottle of water and left me by myself for about 30 minutes. My mind was racing, thinking about what could have happened. He came back in, and he informed me that Kevin had stabbed and killed Jack at around 1 p.m. I was shocked. I had just left the house an hour before it happened, and everything seemed fine. I asked if there had been a fight. The detective informed me that there hadn't been a fight, but it seemed to have happened out of nowhere, whatever it was. I gave my statement to the police and left with nowhere to go, still in shock and confused out of my mind. Our apartment was a crime scene, so I went to another friend's house to watch the news report since the police wouldn't give me any information on the case. Over the next couple of days, the information began to be released. Kevin hadn't just stabbed Jack once, not twice, but he had stabbed him over and over and nearly decapitated him. After the murder, he ran down the road still holding the murder weapon. He called 911 and then informed them what he had done. I watched the news report in horror. We had known he was unstable, but this, he had fully confessed to the brutal murder and he provided the police with his notebooks. He had apparently been planning to murder all of his brothers, my roommates, and me. He thought we were possessed by demons, and this was the only way to free us. Luckily, none of his other intended victims were there that day. Sam unfortunately witnessed the murder, but luckily he escaped. If I hadn't gotten that call from my boss, I can honestly say that I wouldn't be alive today. Okay, so this is gonna be a long one about my creepy uncle who used all kinds of weird technology to spy on anyone he could, including my family and I. So my family of 5 happily welcomed my uncle, who's my mom's brother, into our home as a roommate a little over 10 years ago, maybe even longer. We'll call him David for the purpose of this post. David, over 40 years old at the time, was very kind at first. He was also hardworking and to himself for most of the years that he had spent in our home. He's always been really interested in technology and spyware. If it had a camera or could listen and record, he was highly interested in it. He was pretty private about his room and computers, and we never invaded his personal space because he never gave us a reason to. As time passed, I'd say 6 years, we noticed his behavior got a little more introverted and private. He was extremely depressed and paranoid, but he refused to address these issues, so we left him alone for the most part. As far as I know, he was involved with chat rooms and listening devices. He started drinking pretty heavily, and would sometimes steal my mother's prescription pills to catch a high. Again, these things were pretty much touch and go, and no one in the household really knew how to address his worsening behavior. My dad would occasionally question him and his actions. We don't allow alcohol in the home because my dad used to struggle with substance abuse himself, and he's been living sober for quite some time now. Anyways, we gave him an ultimatum: stop drinking or leave. This worked for some time, but he would just hide from us when he drank, lock himself in his basement room for hours, sometimes even days. We knew he was drinking though, because at random hours of the day you could hear anger-fueled screams coming from his room in the basement level. That or loud techno music that would thump until 12 a.m. The last 2 years specifically have been really hostile and strange between him and our family. Anytime he would return home, he'd be highly intoxicated and ready for bed. None of us would interfere because it wasn't uncommon to get into an argument with him about his odd behavior and heavy drinking. I was a 19-year-old female at the time, and my father was over 45. He became really hostile towards both of us. He would purchase a lot of strange devices designed for listening or watching, which made us all intensely uneasy and on edge. My father told me that once he came home with these new sunglasses and excitedly told my dad that they're really great for watching people, and that he had spent the whole day at the park lurking on strangers. I don't believe that he had any malicious intent towards anyone, but his fascination with spying was honestly unnerving and a big red flag. We demanded that he leave and seek residence elsewhere, gave him a deadline, and even offered him help finding a new place to live. He ignored us for weeks and pretty much refused to leave our home. My mother didn't know how to handle the situation, especially because it was her own brother. She feels like we've betrayed our family or forsaken him. Anyways, it wasn't uncommon to find small, strange devices all around the house that were absolutely unexplainable if you've never seen them before. Things like movement tracking devices, infrared cameras, or mics that would record any audio that occurred in the room it was placed in. He also had control of our Wi-Fi, and I'm positive that he had access to our browser search history or Wi-Fi related information in general. If we confronted him about his behavior or asked him to pack up and leave, he would threaten us. He would always say things like,
I see everything you do. I heard what you said the other night.
Although never knowing what kind of information he was trying to blackmail us with, we were all very uncomfortable with the idea of our privacy being breached. Not having anything to hide though, his threats were pretty hollow and ineffective. My dad wanted to test David and see if he was using devices at our home while he was away from the house. My dad would wait for David to leave in the morning and go to work, and my dad would then shut off the Wi-Fi, sometimes even the power breaker, to see if he would react while away from the house. Sure enough, David would return to our house immediately and question him.
Why's the Wi-Fi off? Why's the power off?
My dad would ask him how he knew about the Wi-Fi being off while he was away from the home. Strange behavior, needless to say. Each time my dad did this, he would return to the house immediately to recover the Wi-Fi and his devices. If he was home and the Wi-Fi went down, this man would have the ultimate tantrum. Everyone would undergo a serious interrogation and be bombarded with accusations involving the Wi-Fi not working. He began threatening my dad specifically, and he would show him his weird spyware that he purchased. David would place the device against the wall and he could hear anyone speaking throughout the home. So much as faint whispers could be heard from the device. David wanted us to know that he could hear everything that we were doing. It was a scare tactic in order for him to remain in the house with us. When he continued to refuse to leave our home after being given a proper eviction notice, we had to seek assistance from the police and court to have him legally removed from our home. We also changed all of the locks in our home to prevent any unwelcome visits from David. Anyways, he's been out of our home for nearly 6 months, and we're still experiencing strange things that have us all on the edge of our seats. Strange faint beeps from different areas of the house, unknown Bluetooth devices that are supposedly 10 meters or less away, and wires that run all around the house. I think we're all just paranoid from his consistent spying over the years, but sometimes I still come across strange unidentifiable devices all around the home. Most of them look inactive and not in use, but I end up smashing them regardless. David tried to insist that we keep his Wi-Fi service after he left, but we had no interest in using his Wi-Fi and immediately removed his router from our home. I discovered that David had climbed through one of our backyard basement windows into the home at some point. I only noticed that someone had been in the backyard because of the fresh snow, which revealed his enormous boot-like footprints. The night that the snow fell, no one was home until hours later. My brother had moved out nearly 2 months before. My mother returned home from work at 3 a.m. My dad returned home at around 12 a.m. My sister had been staying with a friend for the weekend, and I returned home after 7 a.m. after work. I go into the backyard every day to throw a ball for the dog, and when I came across the prints, I immediately felt scared because no one in my family wears a size 12 shoe, and after questioning everyone in the home, they all assured me that they had not been in the backyard as of last night. It was obvious that someone, most likely David, had entered our home through the backyard. For what, we don't know. We haven't found any changes in our home since his unwelcome entry. We have filed a restraining order against him for safety measures, but to no avail. He's still spamming my mother with cryptic texts and threats over the phone. We're so thankful that David is no longer in our home, but somehow he's still traumatizing us with his all-seeing eyes.
Back in September 2019, I ended up meeting up with a girl in the comments section of a Facebook post. She was really pretty and seemed really cool, so after a few weeks of talking, I decided to drive all the way from White Plains to Pittsburgh just so we could hang out for a weekend. I remember a friend asking something to the effect of, "Have you talked to her much on the phone?" And I told him we'd spoken a little, but that we'd mostly talked via text and Facebook Messenger. And he recommended that we talk in long form and about a lot of different stuff too. Otherwise, I might get a nasty surprise. Well, I guess he was right. And now I won't bore you with all of the details, but let's just say me and this girl weren't nearly as compatible as I'd hoped. And then while I'd originally planned on staying the whole weekend so me and her could get some food, maybe catch a movie, I decided to just cut my losses and drive back to New York on Saturday evening. I figured if I hit the road at around 7 p.m. I could be back home by around 1 the next morning. And no doubt I'd be exhausted by the time I got home, but not too beat that I'd risk getting into an accident or anything. So with my mind made up, that's what I did. After getting a quick bite to eat, I was on the 22 by 7:30, and then after 3 hours of driving with the setting sun in my rear view, I saw a sign for Rosecrans, PA. It had been dark for maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and I remember seeing a Sunoco gas station all lit up just off the highway to my left. Then just a mile or two up the road, and in timeless fashion, my gas gauge lit up with a low gas warning. Maybe that's just my luck, that it never lights up as I'm approaching a gas station, only ever when it's just a speck in my rear view. But I was also driving on one of those divided highways, the kind with a whole-ass miniature park between the two stretches of highway, and this obviously meant that there was no turning around for miles. And then I asked my phone, "Hey Siri, where's the next gas station?" And then my phone started talking about another gas station that I'd find if I turned onto US 15. I'd have to drive another 20 to 30 minutes or so, but it was there, and I wasn't about to run out of gas and get stranded like an idiot. And I remember checking the highway ahead of me and not seeing any other cars behind me or ahead of me, so I thought I was safe to actually look at my phone screen to make sure that I'd take the right turn. And I swear to God, I looked for no longer than 2 seconds at the most, and then when I brought my eyes back to the road, there she was, dead ahead of me. I slammed on my brakes, almost giving myself whiplash in the process, but I kept control of my car. The girl went from being a faintly lit shape on the furthest and dimmest reaches of my headlights to being only 5 feet in front of me. And while my first instincts were to yell, "Are you effing crazy?" at her, I quickly realized why she'd been walking in the middle of the highway. She looked to be in a bad way. Her clothes were all torn up, and there was blood in her hair from what looked like a head wound, and I didn't see it until she climbed into my passenger seat, but she wasn't wearing any shoes either. The moment my car stopped, she limped around to my passenger side and then tried to open up the door. I keep it locked out of habit, so her first attempt did nothing but make a dull wrenching sound, but that was soon followed by this blood-curdling screech of, "Open the door, I'm begging you, please!" I still had zero clue what was going on, so my first reaction was to spin around in my seat just in case who or whatever had hurt her was close by. I didn't open my car door right away, because obviously if I was going to carjack someone, using a pretty girl in distress as bait seems like a very effective tactic. But when I didn't see anyone, and when the girl gave me another very convincing cry of "please help me," I guess that seeing the blood up close and hearing the genuine terror in her scream, they kind of overrode my paranoia. Then after taking one final look at her, I unlocked my car, and she practically dove into the back seat before slamming the door closed behind her. And as I took off again, she says, "Mister, we need to move. We're not going fast enough. They're going to catch us." And so I put my foot down as I asked who they were. She said she didn't know. They just took her. And it was then that I noticed the handcuffs around her left wrist. One cuff was still locked around it, but the other just hung there awkwardly. I didn't need any more information other than that. I just put my foot down and burned rubber for a few miles till I thought that we were at a safe distance. I checked my rear view a few times, and then when I didn't see any lights, I slowed from around 70 to a pretty safe 35. But as we started to slow, the girl started yelling. And she says, "Why are you slowing down?" And before I could even answer, she says, "Go faster, what are you doing? They're going to be following me." I'm kind of freaking out internally, but I told her there was no one in sight, and we also wouldn't be going anywhere if a cop came the other way and caught us doing a buck and change. But then she says, "You don't get it. We want the cops. If those guys catch me, they'll kill you too." And I guess when you think about it, I didn't doubt that. If whoever she was talking about had been willing to handcuff her before trying to crack her head open, I have no doubt that they'd put a bullet in me to get her back. It was also kind of a relief to hear that thing about the cops too, because when I saw the handcuffs, there was a part of me that thought, "Jesus, please don't accidentally be harboring a fugitive right now." But it wasn't the cops she was running from. I sped up a little, pushing things back up to 60 plus so we were moving without breaking any speed limits. And then I was checking my rear view every other second, expecting a pair of headlights to appear. And that's when I remembered my goddamn gas tank and how it was almost empty. As you can imagine, the girl was not excited when I told her that we needed to stop for gas at the next town. She didn't want to believe it at first, that the driver she thought was going to save her had a fuel gauge in the red, and she started freaking out in the passenger seat, screaming the F word over and over until I managed to talk her down. I put my foot down again, picked up some speed, and then told her to call the cops and tell them to meet us at that gas station that we were about to pull to. The girl grabbed my phone from the dash and called 911, and then over the next minute or so, I listened to what she said and got a little more info on what had happened. She didn't go into too much detail, but after telling the cops where we were going, she explained to the dispatcher that she'd been kidnapped, taken someplace out in the woods, then handcuffed to a metal pipe which she'd broken to get free. She said, "I don't know a lot," so I'm assuming in response to questions like, "Who were they?" or "Where exactly are you right now?" But I also learned that she'd been held for a couple of days by that point, and whoever had been holding her captive had done some disgusting and evil stuff to her. It was no coincidence that when she started detailing some of the stuff she'd endured, I noticed my speed gauge creeping up to 75. It was making my skin want to crawl off my bones just listening to the stuff those creeps did to her. And in my head, I guess I imagined them to look something like monsters. Little did I know, I'd be meeting them sooner than I thought. So we kept on speeding down the highway until we reached the turn that I'd read about, and then after maybe 5 more minutes of rolling through small-town Pennsylvania and sticking to the speed limit, we came to that gas station where we were supposed to meet the cops. But they were nowhere to be seen, and when she realized this, the girl started to freak out again. She started yelling at me, saying, "Where are they? They said they'd be here. Where are they?" And I tried to calm her down by explaining they were probably on their way. But this did nothing to keep her calm. For a few minutes, the girl sat in my passenger seat, watching a car pass here and there and getting super freaked out about who it might be. Then when a car pulled into the gas station and stopped at a pump, she says, "Oh, screw this. I'm getting out of here." She then jumped out of my car and ran off onto the street behind the gas station and toward what looked like a thick patch of trees. Now I screamed at her to wait, but she didn't even look back. She just kept on running in her bare feet, with that half a handcuff still dangling from one of her wrists. And then she was gone. My yelling attracted the attention of the guy who just pulled in to pump gas, and for a second, I thought that he might have been the guy the girl was running from. But when I told him everything was under control and the cops were on the way, he nodded quietly and returned to his vehicle. Since the girl was sure that she was being followed, I'd parked my car facing the whole gas station, not near a pump. But since the girl decided to run off and take her chances elsewhere, I figured that I'd do what I went there to do in the first place and actually fill up my tank. And so I got back into my car and drove around to the pumps and was opposite the guy that I'd talked to about calling the cops. Now at this point, I'm just kind of reflecting on everything, but we swapped a little small talk about the girl and I explained how I'd picked her up on the highway, scared out of her mind. And he agreed it seemed like something really bad was going on. And then he wished me luck with the cops before he paid for his gas and drove off. But no sooner had he pulled out when another car came rolling into the station. It was a 4-door sedan, a pretty nice one too, and it pulled up to the pump just behind me. 3 men then got out, all real regular-looking guys, probably in their 40s or 50s, and then instead of pumping gas or walking over to the store to buy snacks, they started looking around the area like they were searching for something, or maybe someone. I'm keeping one eye on my gas pump and one eye on the guys that just pulled up, and then suddenly, the oldest of the 3 says, "Hey, you haven't seen a little lady walking around here, would you?" Now, I've always been a really bad liar, and I knew a straight no probably wouldn't pass with this guy, so when the older guy asked me if I'd seen her, I said yes. But then, instead of telling them the whole truth, I told them a version of it. I said that I'd seen a crazy-looking broad in the middle of the highway who'd tried to get me to stop, but since I was pretty sure she was about to try and carjack me, I kept my door locked and drove around her and sped off. I knew not to look him dead in the eyes, so I looked around him and his buddies and then asked, "Why? What's this about? She escaped from like a insane asylum or something?" And the 3 of them just sort of laughed, and I figured that I might have, sold them on my performance. But then as the older guy stayed in front of me, his 2 buddies started flanking me on either side, with one looking at my car and the other looking off in the direction that the girl actually ran. The older guy then suddenly asked me, "Did you call 911?" And again, in what was a version of the truth, I told him I had. I didn't mention anything about arranging to meet the cops at that gas station. I just said that I called them because I was worried some crazy B-word was going to end up splattered on the highway, and some poor schmuck like me was going to end up going to jail over it. I'm not saying it was an Oscar-winning performance, but I tapped into some genuine emotion there. Yet no matter how convincing I thought I was, the guy's two friends weren't moved in the slightest, and one of them was now looking through my car windows, clearly looking for any sign of that girl. I think those were some of the scariest, most nerve-wracking moments of my entire life, praying that girl hadn't left anything behind on the passenger seat when she'd bolted, something like a scrunchie or maybe some of her clothing. I also got terrified that I left my phone on the dash and that the guy might see a blood smear or something on that from that girl, and so you can imagine my relief when I felt the weight of it in my pocket. I was at that point I decided to be a little aggressive, and I don't mean that in a sort of I tried to fight them way. It was almost like a normal person would want to know why their car was being inspected, and that's what I asked. I turned to the guy looking into my car, and was kind of rude and standoffish when I said something like, "Hey, what are you looking for, buddy?" And he looked at me, and started backing off away from the car with nothing but a smile. The older guy then said something to the effect of, "Don't mind my friend there, he's just a curious soul." Something really creepy like that, and then they made their excuses and moved on. As I went to pay for my gas, the three men were still walking around the gas station. They were doing it less urgently than when they'd first arrived, more subtly too, but they were still looking for that girl. I walked up and down in that store after paying for my gas, making out like I was just an indecisive snacker, and then a few minutes after, the three guys got back into that sedan and left. I then made myself some coffee, ate a few protein bars while I told the clerk that whole story, and then walked outside to meet the cops when they showed up maybe 20 minutes after I'd hoped they would. I repeated the story, included the part about the three guys showing up, and with added emphasis on how damned unnerving this all had been, like they had the girl fitted with a tracking device or something. And that sounded like a little too sci-fi for me at first, but the more I thought about that afterwards, the more it shifted into the realm of possibility. I know I was on a lonely stretch of highway, and at this point it was almost 11 p.m., but the fact those guys seemed to know exactly where to stop, which car she'd been in, and which direction she'd run off in, it makes me think that that might have just been the case. Even the cop that I spoke to agreed that if it was some kind of kidnapping situation, the girl could have been fitted with some kind of tracking device, most probably in the handcuffs that she was still wearing when she got into my car. And before he left, one of the cops thanked me for calling it in and added that even though it had been a stressful and potentially traumatic situation, getting the police involved was the right thing to do, and meant that we were one step closer to bringing everyone involved to justice. And the guys chasing the girl had potentially made a huge mistake in getting their faces and license plate on the gas station's cameras. And if it was me that had led them there, I should feel proud of myself. It was pretty cool for him to say that, and definitely made me feel a little bit better about this whole thing, but it was also just about the only thing that really did. Because all my other thoughts about it were dark and dark and more dark, and they played out on the rest of the ride home too, which was a whole 3 hours of wondering what the hell had I almost gotten myself into. I got a call from a detective a couple of days later, and after retelling that story to him with as much detail as I could remember, I asked if the girl had been found. And according to him, they hadn't found anybody but the owner of the vehicle the men had traveled in, and that basically they were still trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The detective said if he needed to ask me anything else, he'd give me a call, but that was the last I heard from him, or any Pennsylvanian cop for that matter. And I still think about that girl every now and then. I wonder who she was, who those men chasing her were, and if she ever got far enough away from them that she wouldn't have to live scared anymore. But a part of me thinks that in the same way she wouldn't just give in, the same way she'd patiently engineered her own escape, those men chasing her won't give in so easily either, especially when she still has a voice to tell the truth about what happened to her. Some days, when I'm in a brighter mood, I like to think she got away, and that she's raising kids with a good man someplace with all that darkness being just a memory for her. But then other days, when I'm not feeling so swell, I get this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I feel like I know they got to her, and that they shut her up for good. My name's Nick, and I'm from England. Back in the mid-90s, when our son was still only 4, we went on a family holiday to Tuscany in Italy. My wife had found this incredible villa in a holiday brochure, which was up in the hills above a place called Lucalena. It looked like a little slice of paradise, and it was shockingly cheap compared to some of the less rural villas and apartments. So without delay, we booked it for 2 weeks, paid the fees and deposit, then counted the days into our dream holiday. We landed in Pisa in the late afternoon, and while our young son Tom hated the flight, he loved the ice cream that we bought him before the journey out to Lucalena. It was a good 3-hour drive from Pisa, so by the time we were within maybe half an hour of Lucalena in our village, it was completely dark. We were right out in the countryside too, so the stars above us lit up the sky, and little Tom fell asleep after staring out the window at them. My wife was struggling to stay awake by the time we came to a crossroads, and I was pretty exhausted from the day's traveling myself. So rather than make a gut decision on which path to take, I stopped the car, got my map out, and consulted it before making the appropriate turn. I reassured my wife that we were only a few miles away and that we'd be at the villa within 15 to 20 minutes, and then I drove up a steep path that leveled off at the top. Because of the slope, I couldn't see what was at the top, so I made sure to crest the hill nice and slowly to avoid any kind of collision. But then, as I did, someone jumped out of the bushes at the side of the road and was lit up by my headlights. I could see that he had a long, double-barrel shotgun in his hands, and he was aiming it right at me. I slammed on the brakes as my wife started to panic. Then I was struggling to get the car into reverse when, all of a sudden, I heard, "No, no," from outside the car. A second man had jumped out of the bushes and was lowering the first man's shotgun while telling him no. They both shot us a look of horror, realizing we were not who they thought we were. Then the second man, who stopped the first from shooting, walked over to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. When I rolled it down, he gave me and my wife this big nervous smile as he said, "Mi dispiace molto, signore," which I knew from my Italian phrase book meant, "I'm very sorry, sir." I didn't really speak much Italian, and what little I'd learned went right out the window when that guy pointed a shotgun at me, so all I could manage in reply was, "Parle inglese?" Or, "Do you speak English?" And the man said, "No, no," in that melodic, drawn-out Italian way, and then said, "No English, mi dispiace." I then heard my wife ask, "Are you police? Policia?" And the man replied, "Si, policia," with the same big smile on his face, and then told us, "Avanti, vai," which just means, "Come on then, move along." And we both thanked him, and by that point, Tom had woken up in the back seat and was getting very agitated, asking, "Mommy, Daddy, who are these men?" And we told him it was the police, but they'd been very friendly and were letting us go. I think my wife believed them at the time, so she was very convincing and reassuring Tom that there was nothing to worry about. But me, I didn't believe a word he'd said about being the police. I didn't say anything with Tom in earshot, and I didn't want to scare him, and arriving at the villa really took the edge off too, because it was even nicer in the flesh than it was in the brochure. But then, once we gotten Tom all tucked into bed and had a few moments to settle down, I told my wife what I'd been thinking. I told her how I didn't think those men were the police. They weren't in uniform. That shotgun looked like it had come off a farm, not from a police arsenal, and they didn't even attempt to show us any badges or identification or anything like that. And she asked me, "If they weren't police, who were they?" And I replied, "The Mafia." My wife just sat down in bed in silence as I made my case, and when I was done, it made sense to her too. A couple of mafiosos had been waiting to ambush someone, and they thought that person was us. The only thing that stopped us freaking out completely was that we were at least a couple of miles away from that ambush site, so the chances of running into them again seemed minimal. She suggested we call the police in the hopes they had an English speaker down at the station, but even if they did, I wasn't sure that was a good idea. The idea of rocking the boat like that made me feel even more nervous than having that shotgun pointed at me and my family, because while that whole thing had apparently been a mistake, having us snitching on the local mafia on our first day in Italy was a deliberate act that might well bring us some undue attention. I'm not saying it was an easy decision to make. I was furious that some idiot had pointed a gun at us, but it quickly became a question of, if we're going to be staying there for 2 weeks, what was the course of action that was going to keep us safest? And that's how we decided to honor that age-old mafia tradition of keeping our bloody mouths shut. The next day, we decided to walk down to Lusalena to do some exploring, and that's how we found this little bar that served paninis, espresso, and assortment of little pastries. I got a coffee, and then while my wife and son got cokes and played around with the table football set in the little games room they had, I sat at the bar and discovered the bartender actually spoke English. We talked back and forth, and he gave me some restaurant recommendations. Then suddenly, a group of older men who were drinking coffee and playing cards started gesturing toward the bar's television. The bartender turned up the TV, which was showing us a news report of some kind. I asked the bartender what it was about, and after listening to the news lady speak for a minute or so, he turned back to me and said, "There's been a murder, not far from here. His was a businessman who got killed. Terrible thing." I asked him exactly how far away the murder had been, and after consulting with some of the older men, the bartender confirmed my suspicions. It had taken place in almost the exact spot where those armed men had jumped out of the bushes ready to fire at us. I didn't rush to tell the wife. I didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was. But later that day, once we were back at the villa and getting ready to head out for dinner, I told her about the murder. Again, it wasn't like anything we could do about it, or rather, it was nothing we were willing to stick our necks out over by getting involved with local crime. The best thing we could do was try to forget about it, head to Lusalena and enjoy some incredible home-cooked food. It was so good that our young son Tom suddenly didn't mind trying new things when they were all so delicious. And so we ate our fill, and when we were all finished, we asked for the bill. The waiter then comes out with the restaurant's owner, and the pair of them explain in very broken English that the meal had already been paid for. Then when I asked who the generous person was, they explained that it was someone we'd had a misunderstanding with. At first, my wife and I didn't make the connection, and we tried explaining there hadn't been any kind of misunderstanding. We loved the food, and we wanted nothing more than to support their business by paying our bill. But the owner insisted. Our money was no good there. Then when we ate there again the second night, with every intention of leaving a large tip, they once again explained our food was free. But by then, we'd figured out who was paying for our meals. It was the mafia. It didn't happen anywhere else, and we made sure to visit plenty of other places because we felt terrible. I mean, as far as we knew, the mafia hadn't really paid for our food, and those poor people were being forced to cook for free. But then, every time we did eat there, they seemed really happy to see us, and the waiter would always bring our gelato for our 4-year-old son without us asking for it. My wife didn't always approve of all that ice cream, but you better believe Tom did. That made us think that maybe those mafia guys really were paying the owners for all our food, and that they were running a little scam of their own and giving us as much as possible so they could claim it all back from the mafia. But since we didn't see them ever again, I suppose we'll never know. They never reached out to us, and we didn't see those 2 armed guys around the village at all, but I suppose it was probably a case of they saw us, we just didn't see them. It was an amazing but very intense holiday, But the next time we visited Italy, we went to a completely different part of the country and had no repeat encounters with any nocturnal assassins. We had to pay for all our meals, which my wallet definitely wasn't thanking me for, but we still found that second holiday much more relaxing than the first.